let's just get into it. Although we accidentally already gave the lecture before the lecture, that was a different thing. Okay, now let's give the actually intended talk about how to practice Tantra safely. And it's going to be about Vedic ritualism. We'll talk a little bit about Shaiva Siddhanta, of course. And I think we have enough material from last week's lecture on the 8 schools of Shaivism and on the basic tenets of Shaiva dualism. And most importantly, I think from the week before, we have enough material having discussed the Vedas and having discussed the Shaiva Siddhanta worldview, that we can now actually make a sustained case for what the foundations for Tantra might look like. And the way I'm going to do it today, Ma willing, is we're going to suggest 3 practices, or rather 3 foundational ideas that will help us practice Tantra safely, of course. We should talk a little bit about what safely means. Like, what are the dangers and what is it to practice safely? And again, I could totally rephrase that. Instead of saying safety, I mean that can be a little bit like triggering, or it could be a little bit maybe unnecessarily sensational. Maybe the better phrase would be sustainable. What makes tantra sustainable, or what keeps us meaningfully and sustainably on the path, as opposed to what keeps us safe. Because ultimately, we're all safe. Ultimately, nothing can happen to anybody because you are God, and God is beyond body, mind, modification, etc. So anything that happens, happens only on the level of the body and mind. Good news, you're not that. But that being said, responsible spiritual practice will also take into consideration all the things that occur on the level of the body and mind. So it's almost as if the idea is that founded upon a strong and healthy body, founded upon a psychologically integrated personality and healthy mind, then spirituality can be built. And of course, the 3 can be worked out together. The perfection on the level of the body, mind, and spirits, quote unquote, as not to suggest that it's some third other thing, but it can be conceived of in that way. All of these things can be done together. Yes. And I want to talk about maybe 3 ways that we might be able to do that. So that's the general gist of today's lecture. And I'm going to draw, hopefully, Ma willing, from the lecture last week and the week before that. So maybe we can do a quick sketch of some of those basic ideas from the last 2 lectures. And then with that material, we can move forward with this idea, how to practice Tantra safely. And my hope is that at some point, I'd like to read to you a little bit from a beautiful little book by Schiffman and Swami, one of the President Maharajas of Berumat, made this point. He said this book is valuable because not much is known about its author. The author didn't have any kind of agenda, it seems like. He just wrote a study on Sri Ramakrishna's life. So this book is by Schiffman. It's called Ramakrishna, a Prophet for the New Age. And it's a biography of Sri Ramakrishna's life, of course, based on documents like Sri Leela Prasanga by Swami Saradanandaji, and I think also on Ramakrishna and his disciples by Christopher Isherwood and Swami Prabhavananda, which had already, I think, come out before this book. So it's drawing from some other literature available on the subject, but it makes some unique points, or it articulates things in a unique way that I quite like. It's a very poetic and very beautiful book. And today, my intention is to read you that section from the book when Sri Ramakrishna falls in love with Kali. Like, I want to ask, what were the conditions that allowed Sri Ramakrishna to feel such ecstatic devotion for Kali? And how did he articulate that devotion in a way that ultimately led to realization of Kali? I think there are a few things we can point out in Sri Ramakrishna's own sadhana that are very, very applicable to our own sadhana. And it's a case for Vedic ritualism, consistency, almost a sort of conscientious, mindful eating and associating and living, coupled with the joy of dualism and devotionalism. So I'm going to make a strong case for dualism today, and why seeing God as the beloved other is very, very helpful, and how that was in fact Ramakrishna's initial approach, and I'm going to point out how that approach was so successful. And then maybe towards the end of the lecture, if there's time, it's an ambitious project, of course. I tend to overpromise and underdeliver because I have an intention, but sometimes there's just so much that we just go off on a whole different tangent. So that being said, I can't guarantee that we'll get to any of this, if anything at all. But there's one thing I also want to do, is I want to talk a little bit about the Vijnana state. Thank you. But the Vijnana state is like a special thing that Sri Ramakrishna refers to that has bhakti connotations, but almost as if it's a post-jnana sort of bhakti. So what is it to realize God and at the same time realize that I am God, and yet still feel love and devotion to that God who I now recognize is no longer an other? That's a unique idea. Unique idea. You can call it, oh, sorry, I knocked my microphone. Non-duality articulated as devotion. how can you articulate bhakti, devotion, which is necessarily relational, in the context of Advaita? That's a unique thing, I think, that you find in tantric non-duality. Shaiva Advaita, for instance, that Sri Ramakrishna also embodies with his Vijnana idea, or his Vijnana experience, rather. So we'll make a case for all of that. Okay. But first, let's just open with a chant to Sri Ramakrishna. ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतारवरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः रामकृष्णाय ते नमः ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः हरिः ॐ तत्सत् श्रीरामकृष्णार्पणम् अस्तु. May this be an offering to Thakur. Okay, so the Vedas. Now, we argued 2 weeks ago, I think maybe 3 weeks ago, probably 2 weeks ago, that Shaivism or Tantra has its roots in the Vedas. Now, this is interesting because about a year or two ago, I gave another lecture called The Non-Vedic Roots of Shaivism. Some of you might recall that lecture. And there we were exploring the view that Tantra, and arguably even Shaivism, has roots outside of the Veda, and that it somehow gets interjected and assimilated into the Vedic tradition over a long period of time. And now there are scholars like Devdutt Patanaik who will argue this. And this argument takes a few different forms. The first form of this is as follows. Before Vedic civilization, which by conservative estimates can be dated to around 1900 BCE in that region, there was another civilization called the Mohenjo-Daro Harappan civilization, or these days the academics call them the Indus-Saraswati Valley civilization. So this was the prototypical Indian civilization, and they were incredibly developed as early as like 3800 BCE. They had like aqueducts, for instance. They had fully functioning cities. They were an urban population with a very stratified society. Arguably, the caste system was already in place. And so this was in the Mohenjo-Daro Harappan Valley. Janam Devi is from that place. Good. And this is arguably the cradle. Many people argue this is the cradle of Indian civilization and arguably of the world's spiritual traditions. So many things can be traced to this place and to this period. And so we know very little about them, though, because no one has yet really been able to decipher their script. It's called Brahmi, and there's a cuneiform kind of script that no one has really been able to decipher because there isn't a Rosetta Stone for it. But there are some scholars who claim to, look at older forms of Sanskrit, like pre-Panini sort of grammar systems and stuff, and then they're able to make some interpolations. And so there are some scholars, no doubt, in India and abroad who say that they're making some headway into Brahmi, but it's still, jury's still out on whether or not we understand Brahmi. The verdict is generally no. So we don't know what the writing was, but they had a lot of iconography that is really profoundly not reminiscent, but foreshadowy for everything that is a staple in Hinduism today. Hinduism Today is actually a journal that people in Hawaii are putting out. That's kind of funny. Anyway, this lecture brought to you by, no kidding, no affiliation. But in this valley, we find lingams. And that's an interesting idea. And more importantly, we find those lingams near structures that look like charanamrita kundas. That is to say, collection, what do you even call it? Like aqueducts or repositories, if you will. So it almost looks like these lingams were being bathed. Nobody can be sure about that fact, but it looks uncannily like the lingams that are being worshipped today in the Shaiva world. So there's an oblong-looking structure set in what looks like a receptacle, which is capable of collecting the water and pooling that water and directing that water into a receptacle. So that structure is there. What's more striking is that there are iconographical similarities. So there's this Mohenjo-Daro Harappan seal that depicts what looks like Shiva sitting in meditation. They call this the proto-Shiva. So he's sitting in like this cross-legged pose, and he has what looks like horns on his head, but could very easily be a crescent moon. And importantly, he has a raging erection. But unlike the other fertility gods in this time period, like in the Mesopotamian civilization, for instance, this fertility god seemed very much unlike any other fertility god because he's sitting down, he's relaxed, and his phallus is going into his spine almost and going up towards his face. So it's like it's becoming merged into arguably the Sushumna Nadi, who knows? But this is an early image of yoga as we know it today. A person sitting in meditation, redirecting Kundalini Shakti up the Sushumna Nadi in order to experience higher and higher orders of reality. So that image is there. Then there's other seals that depict what looks like a goddess near a buffalo. So again, that's very evocative because in the Chandi, the central myth, the Madhya Charita, the middle act, is the battle between the goddess and the demon, the buffalo demon Mahisha. So there's Mahishasura. And this, I don't know if you can, actually, let me see. If I'm looking at you guys, so I don't know. I'm not looking at my screen, but there's Mahishasura. Yeah, you should be able to see her. So she's slaying the buffalo demon, you see. And that buffalo, which perhaps represents the lower bestial nature or pride or rajasic animal ambition or whatever, is there in the Mohenjo-daro Harappan seal. So there's a goddess about to smite a buffalo. It doesn't go, it's not that explicit. The goddess is just usually near the buffalo, but in some versions, she seems to be standing on the buffalo, demonstrating her dominance over the buffalo. Anyway, there are a bunch of seals like this. And there's a seal where the goddess is depicted between two trees. That's, of course, very evocative of Egypt also, because there's that Piscean symbol, you know, the sycamore tree or something like that. Here, it's probably a peepal tree, banyan, and the goddess is in the middle of the banyan tree. And the banyan tree is the very tree under which the Buddha would attain enlightenment, the Bodhi tree. So there's that image of the goddess inside the banyan. And so many scholars have pointed to this and said, see, all the things that are prominent in tantric culture, lingams, the bathing of lingams, the goddess and her conquest of the buffalo, even the Shushumna Nadi and the process of redirecting sexual energy, the Kundalini Shakti up the spine, up the Shushumna Nadi, all of that is present in this pre-Vedic civilization, in the Indus-Saraswati Valley civilization. So some scholars argue that the Vedic civilization came after the collapse of this civilization. Some people say it was invasion or war, but that theory is very quickly losing ground. Now the idea is that it's natural disaster. So maybe some kind of like Vesuvius event, you know, probably some drought or some kind of plague or some famine came. And then the civilization collapsed and a new civilization emerged, the Vedic civilization. Now, there are other scholars, and I'm kind of inclined to this view, that argue that it's actually a continuous civilization. It's not like there was this pre-Vedic civilization which collapsed and then suddenly there was a Vedic civilization. It's more likely that this pre-Vedic civilization just developed into the Vedic civilization in a very natural and easeful way. That's my view, but it's again not something that we need to prove right now. It's not something that we need to really go into more deeply. But the basic argument here is that there is tantric elements prior to the Vedas, and therefore the tantric elements that we find in the Vedas are interjections from this pre-Vedic society. That's one theory. Another theory, and this next theory is held by scholars like Devdutt Patanaik, for instance, there is a non-Vedic civilization. So it doesn't necessarily have to be pre-Vedic, though many people argue that it is indeed pre-Vedic. But in any case, it's non-Vedic. And more importantly, it's Dravidian. That is to say, it's South Indian in nature. It's in the southern part of the subcontinent. So in like the Tamil heartland, if you will, there was a tradition, a Dravidian tradition, which properly speaking can be called a tantric tradition. And then that tradition is then assimilated into the northern Aryan tradition known as Vedic civilization. And that's why in the Rig Veda, we have a veneration of Shiva, but there he's given the name Rudra, and there's almost this sort of like discomfort about him, if you will. Of course, he is revered and venerated, and insofar as the Vedas are personifying the various forces of nature, Rudra is the personification of all that is destructive and dangerous and terrible and in some sense undesirable. Like the storm, nobody wants a storm, nobody wants the lightning. Never mind the creative potential of a storm. Never mind how important destruction can be in the overall scheme of things. Our prima facie gut reaction when we see a storm coming is, oh my God, it's going to sweep away my entire village. It's going to destroy the crops. Like nobody wants this. And it's hard to appreciate in the broader scheme of things how good it can be actually. So that being said, the fear that we have for the violent forces of nature, that fear is naturally then superimposed onto the Vedic god Rudra, who is himself, importantly, the personification of all those violent forces of nature. So the roots of Shaivism have been traced to pre-Vedic and non-Vedic civilizations, but as far as the Vedas are concerned, the Vedas began with what seems to be this sort of fear of Shiva. Rudra, really, a fear and uneasiness of Rudra, but still a desire to sort of include him. So, of course, the Vedic staples are Agni and Soma and Indra, all these deities that would lose prominence in the Puranic age as deities like Vishnu and Shiva became, and Devi became more popular. But in any case, we find Rudra first in the Rig Veda as this sort of uncomfortable outsider. And that idea is captured in the Puranas also. Because if we think of Brahma, as the not Brahman but Brahma as the Vedic like patriarch par excellence, then it's quite telling that in the Puranas, Brahma, Prajapati or Daksha hates Shiva. That's quite telling because in that myth structure, Shiva is seen as this dangerous outsider. He's neither a god, he's neither a demon. He's doing things that are unseemly for Vedic society. For instance, smoking hemp. That's another thing. So he's like a marijuana, ganja smoking Baba, and the idea that he's sitting in a cremation ground, which is important because the Vedic civilization saw cremation grounds as a place of defilement, a place of impurity. So if you go to a cremation ground, you better take a bath after because you've been polluted by just being in that vicinity. So Shiva lives there. He lives in the cremation ground, which in the Vedic worldview is a place of utter defilement. And not only that, he lives there with ghouls and goblins and all manner of things, riffraff that, are outcast. You, as a Vedic ritualist, wouldn't want to have anything to do with these people. And yet, these are Shiva's friends. And not only that, he's doing certain practices that the Vedic society might find unseemly, like using certain substances or something. That's the view that Vedic society has of Shiva. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. In fact, this is another interesting thing, right? Like the fact is that he is accused of smoking ganja, and if he really was a ganja smoker, then why did Sati react so the way that she reacted when he was accused of it? They're apologetic sort of thing. Who knows what's going on with Shiva? But I think basically, very basically, it's a form of xenophobia. Very basically, it's like this feeling of like there are people who have practices and who have norms and values that are not quite our norms and our values. And yet we can't deny that they're spiritually powerful. What the fuck are we going to do about that? And so inclusion and assimilation was the strategy. So the Vedic society, whatever that may have been, was willing to bring this non-Vedic or pre-Vedic deity into the Vedas. So I gave a lecture along those lines. You see. And by the way, like Shiva's ultimate enemy in many of these things, not really his enemy, but his opposite, is Brahma or Prajapati, who wants creation without destruction. Whereas Shiva is the absolute inverse of everything Brahma stands for. Shiva is destruction, so therefore Shiva comes and cuts Brahma's head off and all sorts of things, And Shiva in the form of Virabhadra comes and destroys Daksha's yagya. So you see this in the Puranas, but I think it's referencing this like early Vedic period where Rudra or Shiva is being brought into the pantheon. So I make this case in that lecture called The Non-Vedic Roots of Shaivism. But today, just for the sake of today's lecture, I think it's important to say that there isn't like this non-Vedic or Vedic sort of dichotomy. It might not be as strong as we might like it to be. Like this idea that there's a Tantra and that there's a Veda and the Tantra reacts to the Veda, or like what is Vedic is not necessarily Tantric and what is Tantric is not necessarily Vedic. In Veda, it's called a Kratu, and in Tantra, it's called a Homa, or in Veda, it's called a Yagya, and in Tantra, it's called a Puja. Like stuff like that. I think we want this to be more of a dichotomy than it is. In truth, the Vedas, and I mean like the Sangitas of the Rig and Atharva and everything from the Rig to the Atharva, all these Sangitas and all these Aranyakas, they are heavily influencing Tantric culture. As we see with Lakulisha, who bases his whole tradition on the 5 Vedic mantras from the Taittiriya Aranyaka. So I think it's important to point out that Shaivism depends a lot on the stuff that's in the Vedas. It's rooted in the Vedas in a very real way. So the Shaiva traditions, which are ultimately Tantric traditions, they're rooted in the Vedas, but also the Tantric traditions influence the Vedas. So now when we perform any kind of Vedic duty, it's usually in a kind of Tantric context. So they're influencing each other, which makes me think that they're not two actually. So I've come a long way with this. Like 2 or 3 years ago, I was more of the opinion that the Tantras were a sort of heterodox tradition that has this uneasy alliance, which I think softened over time with the Vedas. But now I'm of the opinion more and more that they were just one tradition, really. And that these Tantric ideas were present even as early as the Rig Veda. Now, the Yajur Veda is especially important for us because in the Yajur Veda, which is not as old as the not as new as the Atharva Veda, not as old as the Rig Veda. It's like somewhere in between. But that Yajur Veda, there's two sections. There's the white Yajur Veda and the black Yajur Veda, Shukla and Krishna Yajur Veda. Now, in the Krishna Yajur Veda, there's like a Sahasranam for Lord Shiva, or Shatnam or something. There are 100 names for Lord Shiva. And these names are directly referenced by the Mrigendra Agama, the Agama, the Tantra of the Lord of the Deer. Mrigendragama Tantra directly references these various Vedic names for Lord Shiva. And more importantly, a lot of the technologies that you find in Tantra are clearly rooted in the Vedas. For instance, the use of certain mantras like Swaha or Vashat or Vaushat. Like, and not only that, the use of the fire as a receptacle for oblations. Like, there's a lot about Tantra that is Vedic through and through. Okay. And this is an important point. As the Vedas, as the Vedic civilization evolves, and it does evolve, like the Atharva Veda is characteristically different when we study it and compare it to the, say, Rig Veda. It seems like the Atharva Veda is a bit more humanistic. There are more, like, for instance, curses in the Atharva Veda than there are in the Rig Veda. The magic becomes a little more worldly, if you will. But anyway, the Vedas are magical text. At the end of the day, they are rituals, and more importantly, they are mantras that create change in the inner world and in the outer world. And those mantras, they change in flavor as you go from the Rig to the Atharva Veda. And you know what else changes in flavor? Our attitudes towards Shiva. In the beginning, in the Rig Veda, it's like, oh my God, we love you, but ew, like storm god. And then this storm god, Rudra, this howler, this fierce, terrifying force, softens into the protector of cattle. That's an interesting idea. His name changes. Somewhere along the way, we drop Rudra and we go with Pashupati. Hmm? And Pati means Lord. Pashu means animals. And by animals here, we have in mind, I think, the cattle, which is central to Vedic society. Like cows are like the heart of Vedic society. And according to some scholars, these cows were also being sacrificed. So now, of course, it's unthinkable. Like beef eating is like the worst possible thing you can imagine in the Vedic, Brahmanical, Hindu context. But it's possible that back then, in this early time, in this Vedic period, they were not only eating the beef, but they were sacrificing it and eating the beef. But in any case, the beef is very important. The cows are very, very important. And Shiva is seen as the protector of the cows. In fact, Gopala, there'll be all these interesting etymologies later. Gopala, who is Krishna, he is the Pala, the protector of the goats, the cows. Gopala. But then the cow has a new connotation. Now it means the senses, eyes, ears, nose, tongue. And so Gopala is the protector of the cows of the sense organs who like to roam about. It's like the word cow, it means a lot of different things in many, many different contexts. And so now cow is the ultimate symbol of motherhood. It's a symbol of Hinduism, if you will. The idea of unconditional, selfless love, pure sattva. You look at the cow, it's very sattvic. So the cow is the fullest embodiment of sattva, arguably. And it's at the heart of our reverence that we feel for India, for the land, for women, like that. So the heart is the cow is the mother of India. But arguably in the Vedic time, they were like other cattle, even horses. Horses were sacrificed too. There's this Ashwamedha sacrifice, the horse sacrifice. So these were routinely slaughtered and offered into the fire and like eaten. In fact, this is one of Buddha's criticisms of Vedic society. He was very against all this animal sacrifice. He's like, does religion really need to involve all this massacre? And the Kali worshippers are like, yeah, we're gonna keep doing it. Sorry, and like, but importantly, the change from the name Rudra to Pashupati is very telling because now Rudra, the storm god, becomes a character that you can take refuge in. He becomes, importantly, the protector of cattle, Pashupati. And as we were discussing last week, the word Pati comes to mean more than just Lord of cows. Pati now means Lord of the universe, and Pashu now means all embodied beings, including cows. So he is the Lord not just of cows, but of this cow. And of all the cows in the whole world of animals, he is the Lord. So Pashu means embodied souls. Pasha, like we discussed last week, comes to represent this world in which we embodied beings have our being. And Pati is God. So God, soul, and world. These are the three categories in Indian philosophy. Ishvara, God, the cause, Mahakarana. And then importantly, Karya, the effect. And the effect is twofold. One, Jiva, the various embodied souls that exist eternally along with God, either as God or as a part of God or as separate from God, but they exist eternally with God. They were never created. So you were never created, for instance. God did not create you. As long as God existed, you existed. That's the general idea. The Jiva is eternal. And then Shiva, Pati, is also eternal. And the Jiva and Shiva share their eternal nature with this world, Shakti or Pasha. And so Pati, Lord, Pasha, or otherwise known as Jagat, world, and Jiva, otherwise known as Pashu, embodied souls. These are the three categories, and you find them as early as the Vedic period. This metaphysics, this soteriology, if you will. Anyway, in the Yajur Veda, there's a very important section called the Sri Rudram, and you actually have heard lots of sections from it. It's quite famous because you might have heard Om Gananadva Ganapatingung Havamahe Kavingavina Mupamashravastamang Jeshta Rajang Brahmanaspata Ana Shinvanuti Visida Sadhanam. That's a popular hymn. It's a hymn to Ganesh before he even had an elephant head. This is another really interesting idea. Ganesh doesn't get an elephant head until the Puranic period in India. That's quite late actually from the Vedic point of view. That's like 1000 BCE to 600 BC. This is still like 4000 BC. At this point, there is Ganesh, Ganapati, but he's pure energy. He's just the energy that is being referred to by this mantra. He doesn't yet have a form or an elephant head. Arguably, none of the Vedic deities had a form, except as, say, like fire or lightning or something like that, you know. They were the energies behind the various appearances in nature. They were nature personified, but it was not like so anthropomorphic or zoanthropomorphic as you'll see with the Puranic period. Anyway, so in the Vedic period, you get Ganesh and you get the Sri Rudram, in which appears, importantly, various names like Pashupata. And no, you can't say that. They weren't necessarily Nirguna because I have to be very careful here, Prakarji. This will take us into Shankara territory, which is very anachronistic. Because when you say Nirguna, often it brings to mind Nirguna, Nirvishesha, Nirakara, Brahman, as per Sri Shankara. Not quite. They were Saguna actually. And arguably they were Sarvakara because they're embodied as nature. So there's guna. You can't say it's nirguna. Shiva has a guna. He's the storm god. And Ganesh has a guna. He is the one who manages energy or organizes energy. In the Narayana Shutkam, Narayana has a guna. So I think this is way before Shankara's and very Buddhistic sort of nirguna idea. Not to say they are nirguna. That might be a dangerous term. So it's not nirguna. It might be saguna nirakara. I think that's I think a bit more technically true. Anyway, so that being said, Rudra becomes Pashupati, and then in this Yajur Veda, you also get that beautiful mantra Om Triambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam. It's a Vedic mantra. You can immediately hear it when you hear mantras like this, right? When you hear Sadashivaya Mahamritunjayaya, like you immediately sense that Vedic flavor, this ancient flavor that's coming from like a tradition that stretches beyond time and yet is immediately present. So this Vedic style worship of Shiva, the Sri Rudram, the Abhishekam, which is typically done during the Sri Rudram chanting, all of that might have existed as early as the Krishna Yajur Veda. And there are certainly 100 names that are being referred to by the Mrigendragama Tantra. And so there are tantras that try to like incorporate these Vedic things. And you know, the word agama is synonymous with the word tantra, right? Mriga means deer and Indra means lord. So Mrigendra is another word for Pashupati. So another name for this tantra is the Pashupati Tantra, friends. The Mrigendra, the lord of the animals tantra. So it's I think a nice note that the word Pashupati appears in the Vedas and it's a softening of the word Rudra. But all those connotations of the storm god don't necessarily go away. That's why in Bhairava and in Kali, the fiercer forms of Lord Shiva, and of course Lord Shiva's consort as Kali, we find these ideas. And I hope like in a bit I'll show you the Tandava, Kali Tandava Stotra. And it opens with Hum Kare Shavarudhe, she who sits on a corpse, who makes the sound of destruction. Attahasa, she laughs terrifyingly. The imagery of Kali and Bhairava is death, destruction, storm, ferocity, ghora, ghora, ghora. You know, all of that is there in Rudra and it stays with Shiva throughout. And that's why you find emphasis on the ghora forms in this particular tradition. Arguably in Vaishnavism, you have Narasingha, but it's a bit stronger. The emphasis is a bit stronger in Shaivism. So that doesn't go away. But then you also get a more Sadashiva, Shanta, kind of Saumya form, which is this Pashupati. So now Shaivism is really starting to develop. And so this is as early as the Vedic period. Then the Shaiva Siddhanta will try to use as much of the Vedic culture as possible to articulate its incredibly tantric understanding of the universe. You know? Of course. And so somebody's just asking me something in a private chat. So I'm saying, yes, of course. Now, this is very important. The Pashupatas and the later Lakulishas, they are like this bridge between the Vedic period and Shaiva Siddhanta. Shaiva Siddhanta is very Brahmanical, very Vedic, but remember, it's Tantra proper. This is called Shaiva dualism, and it's the founding school of Shaiva Tantra. And it's a very important school because it furnishes the rest of the tradition with most of its materials, actually, like chakras and kundalini and pujas and all of that. Like you can trace them back to this particular tradition. So that being said, we have to say something about the Pashupatas. There's this in-between period where a group of Vedic authorities, that is to say, Brahmins who are practicing Vedic rituals, just suddenly develop this deep love for Rudra. This is the point I want to bring up. They attain bhakti. It's arguably not that important in the Vedas to love God. Like bhakti is not at all a big deal. Like you just do the ritual and say the right mantras and get something out of it. You know, arguably, and many people have argued this, the Vedas are atheistic. Perhaps maybe a softer word for that is agnostic. You find in the Samhitas beautiful, stirring passages about the oversoul or the one behind everything, who can sometimes be Indra, sometimes Soma, sometimes Agni, sometimes Brihaspati. Like the name can change, but there is one. And that one, Ekam Sat, is one reality. Ekam Sat, Vipra Bahuda Varanti. You can call it all sorts of things, Agni, Indra, whatever you want, Rudra, Vishnu, but it's one. And that one is the one. And you find this, of course, in like the Rig Veda. As early as the Rig Veda, you have this Devi Sutkam, a profound Advaitic expression of Kali or the goddess or something. But again, for the most part, this one is there, but not that important. And so you'll see in Jaimaniya or in the Mimamsika school, Mimamsa, sorry, the Mimamsikas are not really that interested in devotion. They're interested in fulfilling their duties as per the Vedic injunction. And they are committed to a realism, an ultra realism, actually. The Vedas are ultimately eternally real. The world is ultimately eternally real. And I, as a real individual in a real world who has access to a real ritual science, must enact all of my responsibilities as prescribed by that eternally true and eternally real Vedas. So it's this incredibly mechanistic worldview. If X, then Y. Everything is mapped out in this perfect karmic equation. There's no room really for God, you see. And there's no room for free will, even. There's no room for my articulating an identity outside of my caste, outside of my age. So Varnashrama becomes everything. There are some scholars that argue that Varnashrama is actually a response to Vedanta, but I don't need to get into it right now. Maybe I do want to get into it. So there's another part of the Vedas that we have to talk about. The first part of the Vedas, which I think are very important for us in Tantra, is a ritualistic sort of science. So the Vedas, as Yami is rightly pointing out, is a sort of ritualistic scientific approach to reality. The mantras are eternal, the world to which they refer is eternal, and the use of those mantras will always produce the results when used. So it's very rigorous and mechanistic and scientific. But the rituals are all important. So not just the rituals around the fire, but the rituals before, during, and after, like your rituals as a husband, as a wife, as a child, your rituals in the river when you take your bath, your rituals throughout the whole day, all these rituals, ritual after ritual after ritual. Never mind the fire sacrifice. What to say of the kratus and the yagyas, the ritual proper. I mean, those were so, oh my God, so precise. And when we study the prosody, when we study the linguistic profundity, when we study the mathematics and the astronomy and just the liturgies and the litanies of these people, the mind spins. You're like, wow, this was a really sophisticated civilization. It really sounds like Atlantean almost. You're like, this material is not from this earth. You get that sense. Or maybe it is. It's just from a very old time, and now in this Kali Yuga, we've forgotten this level of science. But it's all Satya Yuga stuff, and it's really, really, really complex, really mechanistic, really rigorous. That's called the Karma Kanda, the portion on the Vedas that deals with ritualism. But, and this is important, there's, as I said before, Gnostic part of the Vedas called the Jnana Kanda. So the Jnana Kanda is the Upanishads. Properly speaking, they are Upanishads, and they create a movement called Uttara Mimamsa, which has a sort of tension with the Purva Mimamsa. So Uttara Mimamsa means philosophical Vedic culture, which is at odds in some ways with the ritual Vedic culture. The ritualists are interested in doing rituals, and being part of society and engaging, whereas the Gnostic philosophers were interested in renunciation. For instance, in the Birhad Aranyak Upanishad, we see Yagnavalkya straight up walking out of his life. He just like, fuck this, I'm going to the mountains. And his wife stops him on the way out. One of his two wives stops him and is like, why are you doing this? And so they have to divide property now, between the wives and like who inherits his household. And as he's walking out of the door, in a sense, the wife asks him, what will you gain by doing all this? Why are you doing all this? And then he launches into an analysis of the ultimate nature of reality, which is very Advaitic, according to one interpretation. Of course, like ISKCON and devotional traditions will choose something like the Isha Upanishad. They might stay away from more non-dual Upanishads. And similarly, Shankara and non-dualist will choose Upanishads that are a little closer to what they want to prove. So Upanishads cannot be called dualistic or qualified non-dualistic or non-dualistic. They can be interpreted in different ways. But the Birhad Aranyak Upanishad, however you'd like to read it, whether it's non-dual or qualified non-dual or dualistic, it makes a case for renunciation. Yeah, like eventually you should leave everything behind and go and contemplate the self, Atman. So now you get this idea of Atman, the self. And so, arguably, this Varnashrama system, okay, first you're a student for 25 years. Then, the next 25 years, you're a householder. You enjoy the world and you do your duties as prescribed by the Vedas. So, everything up to age 50 is like Karma Kanda. Like the Vedic ritualism is front and center in your life, depending on your caste, which is also a very important idea in the Vedas. Like everything in the universe has its proper place, you see. And so each individual also has certain skills and talents that makes them suited for a certain function in life. And no one caste is higher than the other. So the degeneration of caste comes through the idea that caste should be hereditary. That's one problem. And that's understandable because the oak usually produces another oak. So it's quite believable to think that a Brahmin will give birth to another Brahmin or a Kshatriya to another Kshatriya, right? That's at least forgivable. But what's not forgivable, I think, is this degenerate idea that somehow the Kshatriya is better than the Shudra or that the Brahmin is better than them all. In fact, everyone, each individual has their unique role to play in this world, and each is great in its own place. So therefore, no caste is better or worse, but castes are eternally real. They're not societally constructed. That's another reason why we might point to Tantra as being non-Vedic, because almost at every step of the way, it tends to disregard caste, not as dramatically as some people might like to imagine. It didn't go so far as Jainism, Buddhism, and in some sense, even Gaudiya Vaishnavism, It didn't reject caste that out and out. Swamiji defends caste, I defend caste. So like Tantra arguably is not against caste. But it's against how caste is perceived as this exclusionary thing, that there's a hierarchy, that you can be born into it. No, it's by temperament. And ideally, caste represents an acknowledgement that everyone is great, each in his, her, or their own place. Having said all of that, your first 50 years is determined by caste and determined by duty and determined by ritual. And then the next part of your life, and arguably this is the concession. This is how we reconcile the like Uttara Mimamsa emphasis on renunciation and monastic life with the Karma Kanda emphasis on like householder, societal engagement sort of life. The next 50 years, the second half of your life, arguably, is for Uttara Mimamsa. So now you go to the forest with your spouse and you just do contemplation and religious activities like that have specifically the goal of knowledge in mind. So you've already gotten worldly pleasure and you've already done all the rituals that will guarantee you heavenly pleasure as well. But now, more importantly, see, already my Vedantic bias is coming out. But I can't say more importantly, as importantly, one should spend time studying and contemplating and meditating. And this you do between ages 50 and 75. So this is your vanaprastha, your retirement age. And then finally, maybe as a concession to people like Yajnavalkya, and renunciants like that. Finally, in the last 25 years of your life, you become a wandering monk. At this point, you divorce your spouse. It's a very interesting idea. At the end of a Hindu's life, he, she, they should walk out on their spouse because the two of them must pursue God on their own now. Having been together for pretty much their whole life, what's left is now sacred solitude. Khalil Gibran would, I think, approve. So anyway, the two go off and they both meditate in mountain caves and they enter into the most intense period of their life. So this is what the basic Hindu has in mind when he, she, or they considers the good life, the dharmic life, a life that is split into appropriate castes with appropriate duties at appropriate times in life, which guarantees both bhoga, material prosperity, and even heavenly enjoyments, but which is also oriented ultimately towards moksha. So these two goals, bhoga and moksha, or arguably dharma, artha, kama on one side, all of this can be called bhoga, and moksha on the other side. All of these together are called the purusharthas, the four goals of life. The four goals of the soul, if you will. And the Vedic worldview is supposed to grant you that if properly followed. You'll get everything and more. Now, if you try to get kama and artha, that is, if you try to get pleasure and wealth without dharma, that is, if you try to go about all of this in a non-Vedically appropriate way, if you do things that are not enjoined by the scriptures, in other words, if you fuck around and like do things your way, you're fucked. That karma and that artha will not be sustainable. And not only that, it will not be enjoyable. The only way to truly enjoy this world is to follow the Vedas. And that's called the dharma. So dharma means doing what the Vedas tell you to do. And then through that, you will get karma and artha, pleasure and wealth in a sustainable way. But first wealth, and then with wealth, pleasure. And then, more importantly, because of the Upanishads and the philosophical, contemplative aspect, you will also attain moksha. And that's a full life, a life that achieves both bhoga and moksha. And there's a tension here. Many people who are in the like karma kanda camp, they see the young people going off to be monks and they say they're escapist, they're spiritual bypassers. And vice versa. The ones who are going to become monks look at all the people engaging in society and say they're worldly, they're attached. And so, sorry, I got boba. And I forget that boba is like the worst like kind of chai to have for the lecture because you take a sip and you're like, okay, I'm gonna think sagaciously for like now it's ASMR. Now that our Patreon page is basically an OnlyFans, I better start diversifying. I have to choose some boba into a microphone and talk dirty to you or something, and then the fans will leave. Boba boga? Yes, boba boga. A guy came here recently, actually. He was very disappointed. He took the 18 plus thing and maybe a bit too seriously. He was like, wait, you mean you guys don't have orgies? And I'm like, yeah, we're not that kind of group. He was very disappointed. He was like, you mean you aren't kaulas that like have melapas? I was like, no, sorry. We're more the cremation ground type really than the orgy type. Sorry. I was like, we're more about death than sex. Sorry to disappoint you. They're the same thing, but like anyway, took the 18 plus thing maybe a bit too seriously. Anyway, so there's this tension between the two factions. You can see Tantra works really hard to reconcile that tension. A Tantra is that which gives you both bhoga and yoga. Notice it's the same thing. Tantra is like Vedic revivalism in a sense. It's saying the goals of life are neither just liberation nor just enjoyment. If you live for just enjoyment, that'll be good but not great. And if you get, and this is interesting, if you get liberation, it's also good but not great. Ideally, you enjoy the fullest life you can have and you get God. So the Tantra has this sort of reputation for being very bhoga oriented, but that's only because they perhaps are reacting to Buddhistic and Shankarite traditions that are almost exclusively moksha oriented. You see? So I just want you to know, like in the Vedas, you already find this tension between bhoga and yoga, or moksha rather. And that tension, of course, is carried over into the Buddhist and Shankarite world, obviously favoring moksha. And then in the tantric world, you get a strong, in a sense, reaction to that. And now we're sort of in the fallout of all that philosophical and cultural baggage, if you will. So now what's important? The most important thing to point out here is that the Mrigendra Agama references the 100 names of Shiva in the Krishna Yajurveda. The Sri Rudram gives us the Ganapati mantra and the Mahamrityunjaya mantra, for instance. And all of those are found in the Tantras also. So Vedic yagyas become homas and yagyas become pujas like that. So a lot of the Vedas are there in the tantras. You can even argue that tantras sort of grow from the Vedas. Anyway, there were a group of people who were very ascetically oriented. That is to say, they were more like Upanishadic type people. Now, they, like Yajnavalkya, walked out of their households and went to the cremation grounds. Because Rudra, like I was saying, is the storm god associated to destructive aspects of life, and he is to be found in the cremation ground. So these people who left the Vedic household and moved into the cremation ground to practice ascetic forms of worship for Sri Rudra were themselves called Pashupatas. Again, referencing the Vedic name for Shiva, Rudra, Pashupati. So Pashupatas are like early Shaivas, and the Lakulisha Pashupata reform, and that's like really the only thing we know about them because we have a text called the Pashupata Sutra, which is attributed to Lakulisha, who is seen as an incarnation of Rudra, and which is commented upon by a master named Kaundinya. Now, that's the only text we have with regards to this particular tradition, and it's so clear how Vedic this tradition was because it uses for its central mantras the five mantras from the Taittiriya Upanishad, more importantly, Taittiriya Aranyaka in the Yajurveda. So, for instance, Tat Purushaya Vidmahe Mahadevaya Dhimahi Tanno Rudra Prachodayat, or Aghorebhyo Taghorebhyo, those mantras, Ishana mantra, like that, the Aghora mantra, the Vamadeva mantra, all of that stuff. So those mantras are there, and the idea of like fives are from the Taittiriya Upanishad as well, Taittiriya Aranyaka as well. The idea that Shiva has five heads, and this idea of like fiveness, which you can see even in the tantras right now, like we talked about it a moment ago. The arati is an offering of five items, or the panchopachara has five items, or you pour five types of liquid on Shiva. So the emphasis on the number five can clearly, I think, be traced back to the Taittiriya Aranyaka, which is the foundation Vedic system upon which the Pashupatas, Lakulisha Pashupatas especially, were premised. Okay, so then comes Shaiva Siddhanta. So last week we talked a lot about Shaiva Siddhanta, and I explained that Shaiva Siddhanta is tantric through and through, and importantly, the great contribution, one of my favorite contributions of Shaiva Siddhanta is this idea that the soul is inherently omnipotent and omniscient. It's inherently pure. And like I was saying last week, usually non-dualist, they try to co-opt this idea as uniquely Advaitic. They're like, well, it's only in Advaita that you get this idea that you are God. But wait a minute, do I have to necessarily say I am God to be able to like co-opt the idea of strength and power and divinity? Not necessarily. I don't have to be God to be pure and free and strong and omniscient and omnipotent. And the Shaiva dualist argument is that you are omnipotent, you are omniscient, you're a wizard, Harry. And so is God. And importantly, you are exactly like Shiva, but you're not Shiva. That's an important idea. He is the oversoul, he is the Lord of all souls. But you, as a soul, are very much like Shiva. You're identical to him, actually, in the sense that you have all of his qualities. You just don't know it yet. It's a remarkable idea. It's dualism that says this, which is a very different brand of dualistic theism than we're used to here in this country. Or here in the West, we feel like dualism must imply my weakness. If God is powerful and I am dependent on God, therefore I must be needy, or I must be weak, or I must be born in original sin, or something like that. But actually, since God is so strong, I must also be strong, no? Like father, like son, like mother, like daughter, like mother, like son, or something like that, like parent, like child. So, like Shiva, I am omniscient and omnipotent, but there is a mala, right? There's a mala. Now, the dualists will never say soham. That's an important point. They will never say shivoham, shivoham, because they don't actually think that they are Shiva. They know that Shiva is Shiva, and I am me. I'm a Jiva. And right now, I feel like I'm parted from Shiva. Why? Because of Mala. So in Shaiva Siddhanta, that is to say, in Shaiva dualism, the world is real, and there is an actual blockage. There's an obstruction. There's a real inhibiting factor that prevents me from recognizing my own divine nature and thereby being one with Shiva. This is called mala. So the idea of being in the world, like going through all these like activities and doing karmas, is so that this mala can be matured. And the mala here is described as a kind of film in the eye, like a cataract, and the surgeon is unable to surgically remove that cataract until it's matured a little bit. So you have to wait for a while actually, and then once it gets to a certain level of like hardness, maturity, then the surgeon can kind of, I don't know, I've never had a cataract, but this is what we read in the books anyway. The Shaiva Siddhanta metaphor is this. So your life in the world is just that, a kind of maturation. You just go through your life and you reap the fruits of your karmas and whatnot. And then ideally, you speed up the process by getting diksha, initiation. So the initiation idea comes from Shaiva Siddhanta, but it's arguably there in the Vedic idea of Upanaya and whatnot. Anyway, you get diksha, you do your daily rituals, and then all of these speed up the maturation of this mala. And then Shiva comes like a surgeon. Urdhva Rukamiva. He pulls the bondage like just so deftly, like a skilled surgeon. He cuts out the cataract, and then, like a person who's jaundiced sees everything yellow, and then they cut out the jaundice and like, oh my God, everything is gone. Before this, terrible world, political problems here. This person is suffering. Oh my God, I'm so weak. And then Shiva comes in with his grace, cleans out this eye, and then it was God all along. You just realize that it was God all along and I was divine all along. That's the realization. So the realization, the soteriology of Shaiva Siddhanta dualism is that the soul is intrinsically pure, the world is real, the obstruction that prevents you from seeing your true nature is also real. God is real, and He is an other to you who can then, therefore, be lovingly and devotionally worshipped. And through His grace, I will come to see rightly and recognize my innate divinity, which I was all along. So then the claim here is that you can't gain this divinity because anything gained can also be lost. So this is not utpatti, it's not a sudden arising of your divinity, nor can that divinity be a sort of possession, because possession is when you lose your individual autonomy, and that wouldn't be moksha. So the Shaiva Siddhanta analyzes various other forms of Shaiva soteriological systems. Like, okay, here is avesha, possession, as a model for liberation, or here is transmission. As I come close to a fragrant thing, I take on some of its fragrance. Is it like that? Shiva is omniscient and omnipotent, and as I get closer to Shiva, I gain some of Shiva's omniscience and omnipotence. Is it like that? They say no. It's not like possession, it's not like transmission, nor is it like a sudden arising. It's more like recognizing. The Shaiva Siddhanta makes this claim. It's like a kind of pratyabhigya. They won't use that word. That would be a word that would be very, very important for the non-dual Shaivas. But even the Siddhantins, the dualists, they say ultimately it's about recognizing what you are, what you always were, what you always will be. And once you recognize that, then in a sense, you can actually use that omniscience to create and omnipotence, I mean, to create. And so this idea of power is also really important. That's pretty tantric. That liberation should also include siddhi, power. So this is everywhere in Swami Vivekananda. Yeah, Yashodhara, this cucumber watermelon ripening, like it's starting to hit, right? It's exactly the equivalent to the cataract thickening. See, I love that you're making this connection, because once like Shaivism becomes clear, it's like, oh my, like everything is perfectly in line with everything else. And some Lala was asking, some of you were asking actually about like kala. Why do we use the word kala? Why are there five kalas like that? We're asking these questions because we're studying non-dual Shaivism without any reference to qualified non-dualism or dualism in Shaivism, and we're not rooting it in the Vedas. But once we see the Vedas, the Pashupata interpretation of the Taittiriya Aranyaka, once we see Shaiva Siddhanta, everything like clicks into focus, and we're like, whoa, it was one continuous tradition all along, and everything sort of checks and balances one another. So yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. The cucumber watermelon ripening in the Mahamrityunjaya mantra is exactly like this cataract idea, ripening. So then the Shaiva Siddhanta, they sort of dress up this tantric power language with a Brahmanical Vedic approach. Okay, so that's the history that we've studied so far. So we have the history, and I thought that would be just nice, like just to do this kind of survey so we're aware of the development of our tradition, and it helps us appreciate where we are, I think, a bit more when we can see where we've come from. It's a very powerful living lineage that has survived for like here's the thing, we have literature. This is the most important thing. This was all not only written down, but when it was orally transmitted, it was transmitted with a lot of sophistication. So they're not just stories. They're not, again, this is so important, you guys. So much of spirituality is told in stories. But stories are metaphorical, suggestive, and open to interpretation. These are not stories. I mean, stories are there, but these are cut and dried hardcore philosophies. In other words, they're clear, they're articulate. Just the other day, I was on the phone with somebody that up. Anyway, my point is that when you really know something, you can say it simply and directly. It might be the kind of thing that cannot be said simply and directly. It must be indirectly intuited through myth and symbol and ritual. All of that's still true, but we try. And the reason we do is because the Sanskrit language allows for it. It's a very sophisticated system that is able to talk about things that are sometimes beyond language. So that's true maybe of Hebrew, it's maybe true of Arabic too. So there are certain languages that just seem to have the capacity to explore topics that the English language, which was made for trading, cannot. So I think when people say you can't speak about God, well, maybe that's because you just don't have the language for it. It's a very interesting thing. Sri Ramakrishna said that what Brahman is cannot be described, but he spent his whole day describing Brahman in a sense, in a sense. So it has a nirguna nirvishesha aspect, but it also has this range that we can use the Shaiva Siddhanta. That's why I think it's important not to be trapped in one philosophy or one idiosyncratic understanding of the universe. Say you like Advaita, good. It's very important you study Dvaita and qualify non-duality. It's very important you study Shankara next to Ramanuja, next to Madhava, next to Chaitanya, because each time you study a philosophy, it's a new way of looking at the world, and that makes us less attached to our own way. Then you see maybe reality is richer. We never, very rarely do we stop to check with ourselves. Like maybe our way of perceiving the world is not the way. But that's why studying different philosophies is nice because you realize all the ways are so nice. Anyway, that my Ramakrishna rant aside, importantly here, we've pointed out the trajectory of the Vedas going into the Pashupata period, going into Shaiva Siddhanta. Now, what do we take away from all of this? I think in terms of our own sadhana, our daily approach to Tantra or our daily approach to spirituality, we can take a few things away from this. Arguably, the Vedas are the foundation of the Shaiva Siddhanta, Shaiva dualism, or I should say Tantric dualism. And arguably, Tantric dualism is the foundation for Tantric non-dualism. I'm just kind of skipping qualified non-dualism if you don't mind. I mean, a lot of Shaiva Siddhanta actually is qualified non-dualism. It's dualism, don't get me wrong. The Shaiva Siddhanta is dualism. But 18 of their 28 Tantras are actually qualified non-dualist. So I don't really want to talk about Shripati or Shrikanta right now. We'll do it another day, maybe. So I'm gonna say this. There are three phases to Tantra. There's the Vedic part, which I'm gonna argue is coextensive with the rest of the Tantras. There's the dualistic part and the non-dualistic part. And somewhere in between the dualistic and the non-dualistic is the qualified non-dualistic. And somewhere in between the Vedas and the Shaiva Siddhanta, Brahmanical, Vedic system is this kind of like fringe ascetic movement in the cremation ground for male ascetics who are aiming at moksha only through the worship of Rudra in this kind of mortuary way. Okay, so that's the big picture. Not quite, but I think they are referencing something like that. Although the Agora tradition references a bit of like Kapalikas and also a little bit of um, yogini matra chakra kind of traditions. Agora is very interesting. It's a pretty modern word that describes traditions that I think are a little bit more diverse. Anyway, so I think that's of course the roots of Aghora is in that Kapalika, Kalamukha, Pashupata kind of world. But that's there also, just so you know. But they're kind of a fringe society, and the Shaiva Siddhanta is like the major foundational tradition for all the Tantra that will come after. Now, my theory 2 weeks ago was that what is true of history is also true of the individual. So in an individual's life, you live out in your own personal life the entirety of history because history is the story of individuality, if you will. It's a metaphor for the journey of the spirit. There is no history actually. And we don't need to get into any Marx or Hegel here, but the history that we see is really a mirror for internal psychological processes that we go through in sadhana. So my project, if you recall 2 weeks ago, is to take these movements that we see in the Shaiva world and map them onto the life and teaching of Sri Ramakrishna. Because we'll see, Sri Ramakrishna also follows really nicely this sort of historical dialectic, if you will. Like Ramakrishna's life is like a miniature enactment of this entire thousands of years of cultural trajectory, cultural spiritual trajectory, which I think is very exciting. But before I close with that idea, let me just offer a few takeaways just from the get-go. Firstly, from the Vedic worldview, here's what we get. To be in the Vedic worldview, and by the way, I would have had you read Alexis Sanderson's article on this actually. It's actually a very good article. It might be online. It's called Power and Purity among the Brahmins in Kashmir, something like that. It's very academic. It's a very academic article, but it's very good. Power and Purity among the Brahmins of Kashmir. And here he talks a little bit about the Mimamsika kind of approach and I'm just going to type it in the chat, the Vedic sort of Shaiva Siddhanta approach, as opposed to the very fierce, like cremation ground dwelling, impurity oriented power cults of Kali. Like, so, how did Kali end up being worshipped by the mainstream when really she's, for the most part, a pretty fringe deity in the Shaiva world? Or even like Rudra, Bhairava, Kali, these are pretty fringe figures. How did they get mainstream? These are very, very beautiful questions to ask. And Sanderson asks them in this wonderful essay. Anyway, so I'm just going to put that in the chat. Maybe you can find online. It's a bit dense, it's academic, but it's really nice, really good article. So anyway, we have this idea of purity, Brahmanical purity. And as you'll see from the Alexis Sanderson article, what it means to live a Vedic life is almost an obsession with purity. That's the definition. This obsession with ritual purity, above all, but that includes every area of life. So, and Brandon, this is a really nice idea. It seems like the Shaiva Siddhanta approach ends in non-dualism. That's the way I'm phrasing it, right? The way I'm phrasing it is like there's the Vedas, and then comes Shaiva Siddhanta, and then comes non-dualism. But the Vedic people don't see it that way. They're like, Shaiva Siddhanta is boof. It's totally weird. Just do the Vedas. And then the Shaiva Siddhanta people are like, this non-dual stuff, nonsense. One cannot be synonymous with God. No, no, throw it out. It's Kali. And our thing is the one thing. So, like each of them, yeah, each of them think their view alone is right, generally. They don't necessarily see it as a progression the way I'm kind of sketching it out right now. And by the way I'm sketching it out as a progression, and I acknowledged this in the last lecture, is already biased towards non-duality. Because I love non-duality. That's my favorite school and matches my own personal convictions and traditions. Like, obviously, I'm going to make non-duality, the Bhairav Agamas, seem like, the ultimate um, state that you get to through Vedic ritualism and through Shaiva Siddhanta dualism and devotion, then you get Advaita. But again, you can just flip that. You can say you start as a non-dualist by, watching lectures on YouTube about how you are God and finding God and everything, finding love and everything. You watch those lectures, and then later you realize I'm still the same old guy. Like hasn't really like truly meaningfully changed my life. And then you go from non-duality, a kind of beginner spirituality to more serious forms of spirituality, which ultimately helps you overcome your Christian upbringing trauma, and then you can participate in devotion. So again, you can flip this. You could say you can start with devotion and end with jnana or knowledge, or you can start with jnana and end with devotion. So again, the way I'm premising everything, I'm making this like historical argument, but also it's not as chronologically clear how these traditions appear. Like the Vedas obviously appear first, and Shaiva Siddhanta obviously comes after the Pashupatas. But at the same time, they were also all existing at the same time. So they were influencing each other also. And it's arguable that Vedic developments came after Shaiva Siddhanta, maybe, who knows? Or it's arguable that like the Bhairava Agamas, the non-dual traditions, were developing in Kashmir alongside South Indian dualistic traditions. And so the non-dual traditions of Kashmir are influencing the South Indian dualistic traditions and vice versa. Just like how South Indian devotional movements like Sri Vaishnavism was influencing Achintya Bheda of Sri Shankara, like that. So you also have to think in terms of a pan-Indian sort of collaboration. So there are a lot of factors here. So again, I have to be careful and good. Thank you for calling that out, Brandon, because it might not be so accurate to say this. But as Garrett is pointing out, it is true to say that the Atharva Veda is chronologically later than the Rig Veda, and it's also markedly different in character. You find the Atharva Veda has a bit more black magic in it, for instance. So it's a bit more humanistic and a bit more mundane, whereas the Rig Veda is a bit more otherworldly, if you will. If you'll permit me those words. And more importantly, like I was saying with the Vedas, thank you, Jess, there is a progression of Rudra to Pashupati. Like those things, I think those chronological points can be made. But again, gang, this is my disclaimer, I'm very cautious about what chronologies imply. Because just because it's later doesn't mean it's better, right? But often it's implied as if it's a development. Right? So the way I'm making it sound, I know, is I'm making it sound like non-duality is the best because I think it's the best. I think non-duality is just awesome. I love non-duality, but again, that's just me. It could be different amongst other people. And the kind of non-duality I'm talking about that I tend to propose is very inclusive of duality. In fact, it uses dualism as its foundation and as its ultimate expression, even. And I refer to Utpala Deva here. He says, the light, the light here being jnana, the torch, where does it shine the brightest? In the sunlight or in the dark? In the dark. So even if you say duality is ignorance, I will choose it every time because the bright light of jnana shines brightest there. In other words, duality is the best expression of Advaita. Anyway, but all of that aside. Oh, and Yamiji, I think you'll be interested in the new series that we just are putting together. It's called Tantric Vaishnavism. So there we talk about Krishna, Radha, and Gaudiya Vaishnavism and Chaitanya, and we look at some Padhatis from the Tantric Vaishnava world and all that. So refer to that. But anyway, okay. So now where were we? Okay. The three things I think the takeaway we can get from the Vedic period is spiritual life requires as its foundation, at least in the beginning, a sense for the pure and a careful attention to maintaining that sense. So the Vedic person, for instance, would be very conscious about what they ate, when they ate, and with whom they ate. That's an interesting idea. Now, this sounds like a hang up until one recognizes the amount of transmission that occurs during the time of eating. You see, this is why we take people out on dates. It's very intimate. To eat with someone is so intimate, actually. And it's a form of taking on karmas, as it were. So one actually transfers a lot over the course of eating. You can make all sorts of arguments here. You could say when you eat, you become very susceptible because your body is assimilating. And so it assimilates more than just the nutrients from the food. It also assimilates all the vibrations in the space around you. So you don't want to be eating in like a filthy place whose vibrations you don't want to ingest. And you don't want to eat in front of somebody whose vibrations you don't want to ingest. And you don't want to eat food cooked by somebody who is miserable and who doesn't want to cook that food. And you don't want to, incur any of those transmissions of bad energy, as it were, through the simple act of eating. So the Vedic person is obsessively careful about what they will eat, who they will eat with, where they will eat, and when they will eat. In fact, some of them won't even let you watch them eat. If you look at their food, they won't eat that food anymore. So this can be very puritanical. It can go all the way to the extreme where if somebody so much as looks at your food or the shadow of a Shudra falls on your food, you can't eat it. Of course, you can see the drawback here, right? But the thing that we can take away from it, I think, is that food, at least in the beginning of spiritual life, plays a role, but nobody can tell you what your diet should be. Again, back to the original idea of caste and of the Vedas. Each is great in his own place, in her own place, in their own place. So each has a specific diet, actually. It's no one's right to tell you what you can eat. Some of you will eat beef and get closer to God. Others will eat vegetables and wither away a weak thing that will never know anything of God. God is strength. So I rather eat beef and be strong. I don't, but maybe I should. Anyway, I rather be strong and eat the things that make me strong than follow someone else's idea of dharma and become weak. Krishna says there's nothing worse than doing someone else's dharma. And that, I think, means also diet. Don't eat vegetarian food just because ISKCON people pressure you into doing it. It's good to be vegetarian. Of course it is. It's better for your health. It's better for the environment. It's compassionate. Even Vivekananda argues it's a consequence of Advaita. Like you can't help but feel for animals. You won't eat them any more than you will eat your brothers and sisters and friends. Like why would you eat another being? But it's unclear why some beings are holier than others. If you're gonna eat a plant, I mean the plant has a jiva anyway. But my point here is that no one should tell you what your diet is except maybe your doctor or somebody. Um, yeah, so like that's the thing. You figure it out through Ayurvedic counselors, through doctors, but also more importantly through your own understanding. As you eat, you see what is the vibration of this food, and it could change from time to time. But then to be discerning with food is, I think, one takeaway from the Vedic worldview. And not only that, this is, I think, the even subtler point. It's not just about what you eat. People are careful about what they eat, but they're not careful about who they eat with or where they eat or when they eat. So when it comes to diet, a Vedic approach to it, arguably, I'm definitely generalizing and oversimplifying here, is eat those foods that make you strong. And this appears in the back of the Gita also, towards the end. Krishna makes this point about sattvic foods, but he doesn't actually say they're vegetarian, by the way. It's very important. Like, Shri Krishna probably ate meat. He's a Kshatriya. I mean, like, culturally speaking, he probably ate meat. So he's talking to Arjuna, who is also a meat eater. Swami Vivekananda makes this point. He's like, Vaishnavism makes a big fuss about vegetarianism, but the very gods they worship were probably meat eaters. Now, when I say all of this, people expect me to be a meat eater, but I generally tend not to be. I'm a vegetarian. People are like, I'm not defending meat eating. I'm not advocating vegetarianism either. That's the point I like to make in these talks. I'm not advocating any one diet. I'm advocating only strength, which can come through a different diet for a different person. That being said, it's not just what we eat, which Krishna talks about at the end of the Gita. It's also the company that we keep while we eat. That's another point. And be careful where you eat. And so the general rule here, and Sri Ramakrishna would sometimes tell this to his disciples, is it's best to eat home cooked food, and it's better to eat home cooked food, and it's even better, it's best to eat your own cooked food, or your spouse's cooked food, or your parents' cooked food, or your loved one's cooked food. Somebody's cooking for you because they love you and not because they're trying to get your money or because they have to cook for like hundreds of people that day. It's like that's the idea. That vibration is important too. So as you cook your own food, cooking it as you say mantras, as you think of God, that's very helpful actually. It goes into the food. And that's why they always say nothing like mother's cooking. It's true. There's a component there, which we say it's love. Love is a secret ingredient. These are all the ways that the West have somehow captured this deep idea, this Vedic idea that there is something to food and there is something to the way food is prepared and to the way that food is consumed. So if this goes too far, you get what Swami Vivekananda calls a kitchen religion, you know? But to some extent, this can be helpful. Now, we saw this in the life of Sri Ramakrishna because he was quite particular about food. His big hang-up about working at the Dakshineshwar temple, the reason he didn't want to go there in the first place, like I said 2 weeks ago, was because he didn't want to eat the food there. How could he eat the food prepared by a Shudra? The temple was owned by a Shudra woman. However holy she might have been, ultimately she's still a Shudra. And he's a Brahmin. How can a Brahmin eat the food prepared by a Shudra? He refused to go to the temple because of his Brahmanical food rules. Now, this is the same person who accepted his first donation from a blacksmith, which scandalized the Brahmins of his community. Anyway, so when you're 9 and you take your initiation into being a Brahmin, you're supposed to beg because a Brahmin's life is a simple life. That's what I like about the caste system, by the way. In America, you pretend like you don't have a caste system, except you do. Your rich people get SAT prep courses. And then they go to like some feeder school like Harvard Westlake. And then they go to Harvard. And then from there, they get a fancy job at Goldman Sachs. And then they stay rich. And then their kids get SAT prep courses. And then they go to the Harvard Westlake school. Like that. Here, the caste system is all about money. In India, the poorest caste is the highest caste, even in that degenerate sense of the highest and lowest. But anyway, a Brahmin should be simple. A Brahmin should not charge. A Brahmin should live off donations and live a pure and simple life of teaching and learning and praying. Anyway, so Sri Ramakrishna was that. And so at age 9, as part of your Brahmin initiation, you go and beg. But the person you get alms from, the first person you get alms from, is a very significant person. It's a very special thing, to get like this donation from somebody. At the Kali Mandir in Laguna Beach, usually Usha will give it to you, right? Now, when you get your Upanaya ceremony, you go and beg, and then Usha Ma will give you your first banana or rice or something like that. It'll give you some food. So Sri Ramakrishna promised a blacksmith that she could be the one to give him his first donation. And his brothers were like, no, 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 you're a Brahmin. You can't take that. You should take it from someone in the family or some other Brahmin or something. And Sri Ramakrishna said, no, I made a promise. So look, he wasn't fanatical and he wasn't using the caste system to tyrannize others. He told this blacksmith, a Shudra woman, that he would take her food when he got his 9-year-old sacred thread ceremony. And he did that, you see. But when it came to eating food like at Rani Rashmani's place, it wouldn't offend her because that was just the caste norm. And it's not like he's going in front of her and he's saying, I won't eat your food. He just didn't feel like he wanted to do it. And that's something subtle and important too. The way Sri Ramakrishna followed his Brahmin rules is very special. He didn't like punish anybody else with it. It was a quiet sort of internal commitment to his ideals. So beautiful. Anyway, Sri Ramakrishna was very careful about food. And so the concession that he made was that he would take uncooked rice from the store and cook his own rice on the bank of the Ganga because the Ganga is pure. So the purity of the Ganga will counteract the impurity of taking a Shudra's food. So this is the way Ram Kumar, with his very legalistic mind, managed to cajole Ramakrishna, his younger brother, into coming to Kali Mandir. The whole thing could have stopped because of a Brahmin's food rule. But anyway, so Sri Ramakrishna comes and he's careful about food, and maybe we should be too in the beginning of our spiritual life. Then he's careful about whose company he keeps. He loved everybody, but that didn't mean he hung out with everybody in the beginning. And that's, I think, an important point. You can love everybody, but that doesn't mean you need to be available for everybody or hang out with everybody. Some people we have to love from a distance, and that's Sri Ramakrishna's tiger god idea, or, bowing from a distance idea. Just because the tiger is God doesn't mean you go and hug it. And the idea here is that in this universe, there are all sorts of things, sweet fruits and poisonous fruits. They're both fruits and they're both beautiful. Don't eat the poisonous ones. Similarly, don't associate with people whose presence in your life can be spiritually deleterious. And again, that's not a judgment. It's just we're in different places in our life. And you're perfectly valid where you are, and so am I. And therefore, I must not make a concession of my boundaries. That set of boundaries, I think, is what defines a Vedic life almost. These rules. And so we all want Tantra because you don't want rules. But Tantra emerges from the Vedas, which is essentially a set of rules. And again, I'm saying you don't have to follow the rules of the Vedas. You can take inspiration from them, but you ought to have your own rules maybe. And they should be based on something like the Vedas, which are peer-reviewed, corresponded, something like that. Anyway, so we have to be careful with in whose presence we spend time. Yeah, exactly like the fence around the baby oak. Then, and this is more important, we have to be careful about cleanliness. So diet is a form of cleanliness too, but the Vedic people were very careful about bathing. They tended to bathe quite a bit actually. But for them, it would be a dip in the river, of course. But for us, this might look like a shower. But a shower and freshly laundered clothes is very important. And we appreciate this point more when we have some experience with it. So before we sit down for puja, if we haven't taken a bath, we feel a certain way. Then after a bath and after we wear freshly laundered clothes, then we come to sit for puja and we feel a wholly other way. Swami Vivekananda made a joke. Dirty man will never be a yogi. And that's the idea. Eventually, we transcend all of these things: purity, impurity, clean, unclean, all of that. These are to be transcended. The problem is, too many of us want to transcend them too soon. And that's okay too. That's an experiment. Maybe we are that advanced, but sooner or later we get a reaction and we realize, oh, I need to address the foundation. And so here, being careful about what we eat, about who we spend time with, and also being careful to stay clean, both physically in a hygiene sense, but also in the sense of our surroundings. So making sure there aren't dishes in the sink, for instance, making sure that, it's not that you have to Marie Kondo your whole house, although that would be a wonderful idea, but it's more the idea that like the surfaces should be wiped down, the floor should be vacuumed, things like that. So there should be a general sense of cleanliness. Now, some of this might just be coming from health concerns. You see, so don't drink water that another person has sipped. Don't eat food that another person has touched. All these uchishta rules might actually come from the fact that back then the illnesses were very dangerous. If you caught an illness, you would die. There weren't necessarily doctors like we have now, but also they were generally healthier. But that being said, the burning of sage, some people argue, might have an antiseptic property. And so it might not just be spiritual, it might also be a defense against things like cholera. But ultimately, is it really saying a different thing? Might be the same thing, actually, said in a different way. But cleanliness, hygiene is good for health, obviously, physically speaking, but it's also very important for mental health and necessarily for spiritual health. So in almost every case, when a person spirals into depression or inertia, you'll find that their house is a mess also. And they don't have the will, they don't have the sense of wanting to clean the kitchen, or they won't take a bath and they'll just stay in their clothes. Notice there's a correlation, a clear correlation between hygiene and a mental state. Not always. Some people are spick and span, their house is beautiful, and they're suicidal and depressed. Right? Not always, because there are various other factors. And yet other people, great yogis, sit on the top of a trash heap and they're perfectly satisfied. So obviously there are exceptions to this rule. But generally speaking, a clean and orderly house and good hygiene, good eating habits, and good association, all of these things will have a very positive effect on the psyche, which is necessary for spiritual life. So, of course, the Vedic lifestyle was also very nature-based in that their ashramas, their hermitages would have been next to rivers or in the forest, or even if it was an urban setting, that urban setting was still very much in line with natural rhythms. And that being said, time in nature is also very important, but timing your life to nature is maybe even more important. So many people go for like a walk in nature or something, right? And that's great. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're tuned to the rhythms and structures of nature. So in the Vedic worldview, it's very important that you wake up at a certain time, Brahma Muhurta, for instance, because you want to enter into the stream of that upsurge of energy in that very sattvic time and then take your bath and do your meditation. So like that. Basically, the TLDR here, we don't need to get into the details because like I said, a lot of those are there in the Vedas, but they should also be worked out on an individual level. The TLDR, though, is that a regulated, consistent routine and mindfulness and conscientiousness around who we spend time with, around hygiene, and around what we eat. All of these things are the foundation for spiritual life. And when you start a puja practice, this is very important, these things are to be addressed. For instance, we don't offer anything with our left hand until you get to the Bhairava Agamas, like left hand stuff. But at this point, when you offer Kali something, you offer it with both hands or you offer it with your right hand. And when you offer it, you put your left hand on your right hand and then you offer it like that. That simple act of mindfulness is to be followed. It's a rule. It's just a random rule, and yet sticking to it brings a deep sense of grounding. Observances like the full moon, the new moon, the eighth day of the moon. For instance, we must know exactly what day of the moon it is today. Do we know? We must know. We must know that on Friday it's going to be the eighth day. And more importantly, we must know that it's going to be the equinox on Friday. How can we abide by the structures of nature if we're not even aware of those structures? And intuiting it is one thing, but knowing it is another. Intuit it and know it, like we were saying last week also. So now we should know it's the fourth day of the moon, going into the fifth day of the moon in the Krishna Paksha, the waning cycle. So just like that, the Vedic people would take 16 portions of food on the full moon day, and then they would decrease that portion on the 15th day, 14th day, 13th day, 12th day as they went down the Krishna Paksha. And then they would increase it again as they went up the Shukla Paksha. So their eating was timed to nature, their sleeping was timed to nature. It's really a very scientific and ordered and structured society and a very regulated and regimented life. Right? Which is very, I'm not saying we do that. In fact, of course, I don't do the Chandranayana. So it's not like I take 16 portions of food on the full moon and then drop it down. But I do that with mantra. So often I would suggest that style of Purasharana where we start chanting mantra, maybe 10 malas on the new moon, and then we go up one mala every day. So Pratipada, you're chanting 11, Dvitiya, you're chanting 12, Tritiya, chanting 13, Chatur, like that, you're going up. But anyway, that aside, this again must not be taken too literally, lest it become oppressive and externally imposed. So when it comes to rules, try not to follow rules that are externally imposed, rules that are placed upon you by someone else. Again, there's somebody else. What do they know? But you know. You have a sense for what works for you and what doesn't. So we have to become mechanical. Prakar's got it exactly right. So G, the Vedas are mechanical, karma is a mechanism, and it's time we become a cog in that machine. This is called Mimamsa. And when you read Alexis Sanderson's article, you'll see that actually opting into this somewhat oppressive structure of rules and regulations is actually the goal. We sublate our individuality and, in some sense, our free will by submitting to this corpus of procedures and practices. So, in the Vedic worldview, you don't have a choice about this. The moment you are born into a Brahmin family, you download all these rules and you live by them, at least until you move to America and rebel against all of them. So, like, but for those who grow up in that setting, you don't choose your rules. The rules are already imposed by the Vedas. Sure, you do. But now the argument is if a person wants to play guitar, to be free on the guitar, they must first master all the rules. So if you just give someone a guitar and say, okay, be spontaneous, nothing will happen. But if you give someone a guitar and you teach them scales, and then every day they practice their ragas, rag bhairavi, something they're playing, then they can play an alap because they've mastered all the rules, you see? So my argument here is very unlike almost literally everything you hear from me everywhere else. Because I'm always talking about Swatantriya and Advaita. But I had this, like, I guess I was arguing that the premise, the foundation for true and abiding freedom is in the beginning, not always, but in the beginning, to bind ourselves to some structure, regiment, consistency, rules, rigidity. This is a historical fact. You don't have to take it as a prescription. Again, I'm presenting all of this as a chronology and historicity, but it's a historical fact that those who came to Tantra came to it through this type of lifestyle. Again, I'm addressing why when people in the West tend to practice Tantra, and now increasingly so also in the East, they get adverse results. I'm like, what's going on? Well, because the set and setting is different, right? Like back then, somebody comes into a tantric initiation, probably from a Vedic background, and they probably were already waking up with the sunrise, or probably eating very carefully, living a regimented, nature-based life like that, you see. So yeah, if you really want to play the guitar, in the beginning you must sit down and learn your scales. You must bind yourself to the scales. You have to give yourself a foundation. Yes. So I think this is a great way of putting it, Stacy. It's structure, it's foundations, it's just preliminary. Okay. So this is the Vedic lifestyle, but there's one more thing, and I stressed this I think 2 weeks ago, and it's worth stressing again. A Vedic lifestyle is also about societal engagement. So on one level, there are these niyamas, or rather yamas and niyamas, these intrapersonal rules for yourself in order to like live a regimented life, and that comes in with food and with sleep and with hygiene and with your routines and all of that. But there's also this interpersonal dimension. So the intrapersonal stuff is there, but the interpersonal stuff I think is equally important, which is engagement with society. So for instance, in the Vedic worldview, you owe 5 debts. You owe a debt to your ancestors, and you perform ancestor worship to fulfill that debt. Or you go on a pilgrimage to a place called Gaya, and there you make obeisances to your ancestors. Then you have a debt to the rishis, and you fulfill that debt by studying the Upanishads or the Vedas or something. So you can honor the rishis by worshiping them ritually, but also by studying their work. Then you have a debt to your community. So you engage in some kind of work that's productive and enriching for your community. Then you have a debt to the poor in your community. Or, oh, sorry, I'm sorry, the community includes the poor. You have a debt to the gods. Again, this is in no particular order. I'm just calling them as I remember them. But then to the gods. So this is where you perform ritual actions to appease the various forces of nature. That's why I say, idam janamama, like idam samaya, idam janamama, this is for Soma, it's not for me. That whole namaha, the namaha might be traced back to the Vedic namama. At the end of a Vedic mantra, you say, this ghee, grita, is for Soma, it's not for me, namama. And now that namama in the Vedas has become the namaha in the Tantras. That's another link, I think that's quite nice. Namaha means namama, namama iti namaha. What it means to say namaha, salutations, is to say not mine but yours. May thy will alone be done, O God, like that. So anyway, this idea. That's a beautiful idea, right? Like after Namaha traced back to Namama. See, again, another link between Tantras and Vedas. But another thing, um, I think importantly is that once you worship the gods and stuff like that, yeah, and the debt to have progeny is included in the debt to the ancestors. So to honor your parents and your grandparents and your parents, you have to have children. That's one thing. Like a Vedic householder's duty is to have children. And so one of the tensions in the Vedic worldview is like, hey, this person has become a monk at age 16. They have no child and they will be childless. Have they failed their debt to their ancestors? And also, they don't make any money. So how can they donate and contribute to society? Have they failed their debt to society? Now they're just a burden on society. Now we just have to feed them. And more importantly, they don't do pujas anymore. They don't worship the gods. They're just sannyasins wandering about, meditating on Atman or something like that. So that's the tension you see. Because all of these debts, and again, make no mistake, they are debts. They're not being paid by the sannyasin. So the karma kanda people react against the jnana kanda people and vice versa. And the jnana kanda people are like, is your life nothing more than debts? And like all that stuff. It's this whole debate. Anyway, then you pay your debt to the animals. I like that. So after worshiping the gods, now you just help the animals. Also, you're a steward of nature. Like I was just bashing that idea a moment ago. But here, the idea is you put out some sugar for the ants, and that might be it. I've seen many an Indian auntie. That's their worship of the animals. They just put a bit of sugar outside. My grandmother used to do something like this. So anyway, importantly, in the Vedic worldview, you do these 5 things. But the TLDR of this is you don't have to do it in this particular way. But the TLDR is one should engage with society. You see? And Yamiji, I hope you can appreciate what I'm trying to do here. I'm reinterpreting all of these things that we grew up with and trying to modernize it and make it more relevant for a day-to-day life. So I'm not going to say you have to do Pitri Tarpan and all of that. I'm not arguing for the form that it took back then, but I'm arguing for the principle for which those forms stood, which is that one should engage with society, with the animals, with the community, with the poor, with the gods, and by gods I mean with the forces of nature, with the ancestors, all of these things, and with the rishis, the elders of our community whose works we ought to study. So Yeah, so that's the project now, is to show how we can incorporate the Vedic worldview into our day-to-day life as tantric sadhakas and sadhvis. So the takeaway from the Vedic period is this: one should have a balanced, consistent regiment. One should have a regulated life. One should be careful about one's company and one's food. One should be particular about one's sleep habits and waking habits and align their life to the cycles of the moon, for instance, or the cycles of the sun. And most importantly, one should engage with society, you know. So all of these things: hygiene, food, sleep, community, and doing some good to the world. So that's why a lot of people come to Tantra who haven't yet done anything in the world. By that I mean they don't yet have a sense of self-respect, probably because they haven't applied themselves. And largely that's a failure in society. You know, their education system failed to evaluate their strengths in a way that actually empowered them. Maybe they were disempowered in their upbringing for various socio-economic circumstances. Maybe they were unable to contribute to society in some way, etc., etc. But there's a really easy fix to this. Just sign up at some SPCA or something. Go volunteer at a soup kitchen. Just do something. Like, just get out there and help somebody in some way. But then apply all the Swamiji Karma Yoga stuff. But I'm not even going there right now. Like, right now, I think it's just important that a person gets this basic sense of self respect, dignity, integrity, and a feeling of their own strength by engaging with the world. Yeah, this is called Karma Yoga, actually. Karma Yoga has the connotation of doing your duties as per the Vedas, you know? Yeah, exactly. So just, you're right on the money here. Making everything from bathing to eating to sleeping to even fucking to even like doing work, all of these things, they're part of the moon cycle. It's all a ritual. So it exactly, I think you're intuiting is the way to see God in everything is to be mindful in each and every moment. So when the Buddhists start talking about mindfulness, the Vedics are like, welcome to the party, bro. Like, you want to talk about mindfulness, but again, Yami is right. Like, this can easily become mechanic. But even then, I think the Vedic people don't mind, because to kind of follow all of this, the daily ritual, as mechanical as it becomes, still there's a level of conscientiousness, mindfulness, presence that is required for this kind of thing. And you can see how this will give us a nice foundation for the practices of Advaita later on. So, once we do, like, maybe working a job can be very helpful. Again, the Vedic worldview has this in mind. Do your duty. So, whatever your skill is, no job is better than worse or the other. Just do that job. So like, be a householder in the sense that enter into a relationship with somebody maybe, and have children maybe, do a job maybe. All of those things are going to be good for your spiritual life. And that's why I think in the Jewish tradition they have this idea that you cannot even begin to learn the mysteries until you're like a 40-year-old rabbi with a wife and kids. Right? Like, you have to be 40 to learn the Kabbalah. I think that's an important point, actually. It's a very Vedic sort of conservative Indian idea also, that one needs to get a certain level of life experience. Now, it's arguable that this could have come in a previous life. It doesn't have to be this life that you do all this stuff. Maybe at a young age you become a spiritual prodigy, having already covered all the bases like in some previous life, right? Um, yeah, yeah. And then not only that, like Shankaracharya, importantly, was a Brahmin, and he basically moved amongst other Brahmins. And the argument is that the mattas, the Shringari Matta even, however tantric they might be, they're rooted in the Vedas actually, and their life is very Vedic. But that being said, it's very important to point out that the Vedas and the kind of regulated, societally oriented life that it promotes is the foundation for sadhana. So that's why it's very sad, because a lot of people come to spiritual life who are not very confident, or who are maybe running from the world, or who are kind of dysregulated or discombobulated, and their day-to-day life is not structured. And so getting those things in order, not necessarily first. I'm not saying that you have to do all this stuff first, because again, this can also be a trap. It's like, it'll never be perfect. The house will never be perfectly clean. You'll never be perfectly clean. And if you wait to come to God until all of that is sorted out, you might never get to God. But just some basic sense of this, I think, can be very helpful. So before we freak out, and spiritual life is full of these little freakouts, we should ask ourselves, have I done the dishes? It's almost like that meme. It's like, just drink some water and you'll feel better. It's a bit like that. We're very quick to diagnose our problems as spiritual, but they're usually just because of the dishes in the sink, or because of hygiene, or because of bad diet, or because of certain people in our life whose influence is not helpful right now, without any judgment towards them. So, yeah. um, Yeah, exactly. So that's why, like, we don't want to put off spiritual practices. We just have to do our best, and arguably, we most of us could be doing more to cover this base. That's level one. So the three things that we can do to stay safe in tantra, I think level one is live a balanced, regulated, consistent life, being mindful about diet, about sleep patterns, about day-to-day activities, about company, about hygiene, but most of all, like engage with society and like do something. Maybe working a job or volunteering. These are all ways to prepare yourself for spiritual life. And you can include in this also all manner of strength and physical training. So this hatha yoga, I think, is you can plug it in here even. Because hatha yoga and just going to the gym or like going on a run or going on a hike or like just being physically engaged to take care of the body, that's also part of this. And arguably back then, a lot of the duties that people were performing involved a lot of walking or, you know, yeah. So with the picture that we have in mind of the spiritual practitioner of India, whether a man or a woman or neither, is somebody strong, actually. You see Mahadevi Akka, how powerful she was. So this doesn't have to be like an idea of toxic gym bro mentality. It's just the idea that the body must be strong and there is no body type. In fact, if we look at Shankara or Ramanuja, they don't fit the model of like American roided up gym bro. They're very skinny Indians, but they're strong, good core strength, and they could walk really long distances and they were full of energy. So, this kind of thing, we find that diet, sleep, hygiene, these things contribute to energy, and you need a lot of energy for spiritual life. Okay, now, energy conservation. Yeah, not CrossFit though, one cult at a time, Jamie is saying. That's good. So, we have that. Oh, and by the way, I saw a documentary my wife showed me, and it was about this guy who's like trying to live forever. I was very touched actually because he had turned it into a sadhana. Many people criticize him, but he said something interesting. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, when I lived according to my mind, I was miserable. But then when I took my mind out of the equation and did just exactly what the science told me my body needed, I might not like it, but I'm much happier. He's like, I don't even exist. He said that. He like deleted his ego. He just like did this yogi thing of like complete sublation of this individual willing self. And he submitted to determinism, biological determinism. So the body has certain scientific like facts about it. He just follows that. He eats as much as his scientists tell him to eat. He sleeps when his scientists tell him to sleep. He can only come as many times as scientists tell him he can come, like that. He doesn't do anything but what the scientists tell him to do so that he can prolong his life. The gene therapy stuff aside, no, is Gene still here? Yeah, the gene therapy stuff aside, um, he actually, interestingly enough, became something of a spiritual teacher. He's like something of like a spiritual teacher now because he started teaching this. Many people criticize him because he also has like a very expensive line of like supplements and things and they criticize him because his lifestyle is only possible because he's like an insane tech billionaire type. It's like, oh, it's not for everybody. But then again, he's not doing it for everybody. He's doing it as his own personal quest. And he's saying, like, oh, like, like eventually other people will be able to benefit from this research. He's like a human guinea pig in some sense. And yeah, what was his name? Brian something? Mr. Brian. Yeah, the reverse aging guy. He's actually like aged less or something. What's the documentary called Don't Die? I think, yeah, Brian Johnson. Thank you. Brian Johnson G. So Brian G doesn't want to die. And the documentary is called Don't Die. Anyway, I liked it. I enjoyed the documentary a lot. It's very yogic. But at the end, we see his like Zoom meetings and we see how he's getting together with people, and it's like a straight up spiritual community. And there are some people who argue that this is the most relevant kind of spirituality or something like that. Like anyway, the point is there's something deeply spiritual about just being healthy or just having a regime or just sublating one's own individual impulsiveness. There's something spiritually nourishing about being strong. So we find this with Swami Vivekananda a lot. He always emphasizes physical strength, emotional, psychological well-being before we even get started with spiritual life. And I think my feeling is that the Vedic lifestyle, dharmic lifestyle, with all of its drawbacks, I think basically it's an attempt to be physically and psychologically whole through the practice of discipline, structure, routine, and regimen. Maybe we'll just put it that way, right? So this is a very high barrier of entry, but if we honor it, our spiritual life will be, I think, much, much, much smoother. I've noticed a lot of the times the problem is a sequencing error. People come into spiritual life, but they don't have this basic psychological and physical well-being. Then they involve themselves in very powerful sadhanas, and then who's surprised when after a few years of that or after a few months of that they get a reaction? I'm not saying you can't start the sadhanas until you're perfectly physically and psychologically well. I'm saying that as you do the sadhanas, one should also make sure that we're visiting the doctor, or that we have health insurance, or that we are paying our taxes, or that we're financially healthy, and all of these things, like these basic human things, important, very important. But yeah, so that's the thing. And I think the in between here is that, like, for the Vedic ritualist, these rules were all externally imposed upon them. You see? So just yesterday, I was talking to my friend who's strongly reacting against all of them, because the fact that there are externally imposed rules, you must reject them because the soul is intrinsically free. So the kind of trade-off, or my concession here, Jess, is that you choose your own rules, but you must have them. So using Swatantriya, one must opt into their own structure. Yes. So yeah, so the first thing, thank you, Yashodhara, thank you. So the first thing is this: live a Vedic lifestyle, live a dharmic lifestyle, which means live a regulated, balanced, mindful, conscientious lifestyle, which prioritizes social engagement. So that's the first one. That's number one. How to practice Tantra safely? Just be a chill dude. Like there's like that meme of that dog, and he's like just like kind of hanging out, and he's like a chill bro. Something like just manage life first. That's, I think, very important. That's how we were joking with Jess in the car. It's like many people ask me about what if I get Sydney's. I'm like, bro, you couldn't finish your high school diploma. Chill. Like, I'm not so sure you'll succeed at these sadhanas. You've given up on everything else in your life. I'm not at all convinced that you will succeed in this sadhana. Succeed at something else first, Then we'll talk tantra. But that's the thing, whatever, whatever. And I was making a joke, and I was also like, of course, there's socioeconomic things, like, just don't worry. But my point is that we should win at life. We shouldn't come to spirituality like a dog with its tail between its legs, whimpering and shivering and saying, "The world is not for me. You can't fire me. I quit. I'm going to realize God now." It's much harder to realize God than it is to, like, start a multi-billion-dollar company or something. Maybe do that first. Then you'll have Brian Johnson money. Then we can do some spirituality. Okay. But just like, be the kind of person who will succeed at life, and then you will succeed at spirituality. And yeah, Jess, I think that's what we came to offer Ma your mind. You must have it first to give it. Right? Like, before you can make an offering of yourself, you have to have yourself together. It must be yours. You must be self-possessed. Then you can make an offering. That's the problem. Everyone wants to bring Ma a head, but they're not very desirable heads. They come to Ma like, "Oh," and then Ma's like, "I'm like that. Like, I can't. You can't even stay still enough for me to chop the head off. So come sane," and she'll easily pluck the cucumber like that. So what is that sanity? Again, it cannot be externally imposed. How can an insane society tell you what's sane? So, like, that being said, don't use external metrics for health, for diet, for regimen, and for sanity. You find that balance for yourself, but it must be there. That's the first thing. Now, the second thing, this is where it gets kind of nice and beautiful. The first part is very paternalistic. It's all like Shiva, 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 rules, 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 masculine, 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 if you will. Now comes something profound. It's arguable. Like, let's use a Sankhyan worldview here. It's arguable that these rules or these structures, or I prefer the word structures to rules, but like these safeguard structures, they create a higher quotient of sattva in the body and the mind. So taking care about what we eat, um, and how we sleep and who we hang out with, and all these things will create sattva from this Sankhyan point of view. And that sattva, when it's cultivated, sattva means a spiritual kind of lucidity or clarity, which comes through these Vedic ways of living. From that sattva arises bhakti spontaneously. So arguably, these Brahmins who were practicing the Vedas, they were Mimamsakas, they were doing rituals and whatnot, but then they generated this sattva through their regulated life, and through that sattva, they attained bhakti, devotion for Rudra, which they went then and articulated in the cremation grounds. They left all these rules behind because bhakti came, devotion came. So devotion, real devotion, love for God, can come at any time, but it's usually cultivated through a regular routine, routinized life. So bhakti is the next step. So level two, a lot of people come to tantra, but they don't yet have bhakti. In other words, they don't have the love for the deity that they want to do sadhana for. Many people come with fear, many people come with desire. They're afraid of something and yet they want to worship something. I'm like, you're afraid of Kali. You're asking me how to worship Kali, but everything you're saying about Kali sounds like you're worried that you're going to do something wrong and she's going to kill you. How can you do this kind of puja if you're afraid? Every step you take is in fear. And many others come out of desire. They're like, oh, sad, you know. Anyway, many come with desire. Like many want me, not ma. And so ma is a means to me. That's the idea. So that won't work either. Devotion is when you love the deity for love's sake. It is your nature to love, and it's her nature to be loved. She's beautiful, or Bhairav is beautiful. Like one feels this natural affinity for that deity without any fear, without any desire. That's called bhakti, actually. This interest to get closer to the deity for its own sake. Right? So, yeah, it's quite sweet. But no, that's the idea. Like, bhakti is itself a preparation for Tantra. So, that's what I want to posit. That once we have a Vedic dharmic lifestyle, then comes bhakti actually. And bhakti is the natural arising out of sattva. And then when that bhakti comes, now we're ripe. We have both a regulated lifestyle and we have bhakti. Then we can come to Tantra. So, number two is generating bhakti. And I'll close with a reading from Schiffman's Prophet of the New Age, where we get a taste of Ramakrishna's sudden upsurge of bhakti. Remember, he's a spiritual prodigy. So he was already not only a very accomplished Brahmin who was living a very regulated Brahminical life, but from a very young age, in the death of his father, he was already deeply contemplative and he spent a lot of time with sadhus. And of course, it doesn't hurt that he's the avatara also, right? So, like, the comparison to Ramakrishna, of course, can be a little difficult to make because he's God. But again, the point of God coming as Jesus and Krishna is to model something out for us. So I think it's a good comparison. I'm going to read to you a little bit from this book. It's a very beautiful passage about how he comes to Kali. In other words, how his devotion for Kali emerges. And you know, it feels a lot like those people who went to worship Rudra, how they were Brahmins and they were so rule following, and then suddenly, because of that, maybe, or despite of that, I don't know, something happened and they fell in love with Rudra and they plunged into like this deep, ecstatic, uh, rule shattering love for God, which we see in Ramakrishna. As a Brahmin, he went from being so careful about food rules to meditating naked in the cremation ground without his upanaya in order to realize Kali. Does that. You know, love transcends rules. But check this out. In the beginning, before devotion, I am breaking my rules because I love me. You see, the breaking of rules here is because of indulgence. I'm breaking them because I don't feel like doing them. That's the difference. When we fall in love, Ma is breaking those rules. I can't help but do this because I love her. So the question is, why am I breaking my rules? Am I breaking them because I love me, or am I breaking them because I love Ma? The rules will be broken. The question is, what are they being broken for? That's the thing. So now we get the second phase, which is bhakti, the breaking of rules. Ultimately, that's the culmination of bhakti. That's called devotion. That's the second thing. So we need to have devotion for that deity or for God itself first. Now, for steps one and two, I'm going to suggest something that I think will be hopefully quite helpful. Puja. I almost always make this point, but and people are usually very resistant to puja because, specifically because, it requires rules. Nobody wants to do puja because puja is a rule-oriented practice and it requires that we stay grounded throughout the day and do things at the right time. You know, so like Ma gets her worship maybe in the morning, and then you do that puja the way that you were taught to do it, whether you want to or not. Now, our problem is we only want to do things when we feel like doing them. But once we bring Ma into the house, we just commit to doing the puja every day for her, whether we feel like it or not. She has to eat after all. We have to feed her, and we have to ritually offer her the food. So, part of having an altar and part of the upkeep of the altar is the daily diligence of doing the rituals, whether or not we feel like it. So I think an in between here is when you enter into the pujari role, that is to say, when you start worshipping in a formalized, ritualized way, you do get some of these Vedic benefits and you get some of these bhakti benefits, you see. You develop love for God, but more importantly, you develop, I think, that which supports the love: structure, discipline, regime, self confidence, you know, all of that stuff. And part of doing puja also is communal. Maybe you bring your friends together and you feed them all. You do a puja as a service for your community and then you feed them with the prasad. Or you don't even have to like tell them that you gave the food to Kali. You do the puja, you cook some food, give it to Kali, and then later nobody needs to know that you were outside worshipping the dark god of the forest. You know what I mean? Like that might be difficult for people. But you just come downstairs and feed everyone with that food, and then that's part of your puja, you see. um, so that's the thing. So no fear. No fear, no desire. We come to Ma naked as only a child can, soiled, unabashed, unashamed, ready to be loved fully and ready to love fully. And that can come through puja. So puja, this is what I want to suggest. And this is maybe the third way to practice tantra safely. Actually, the third way for me, like before coming into this lecture, was we need a guru. But like I think I'm gonna amend that now. We need puja. And arguably the guru is implied. To do puja, one needs a guru. In other words, one needs somebody to show them the ropes. And importantly, that guru will probably also give a mantra for that deity whose puja you are performing. But I think importantly, the practice of puja not only implies the presence of a human teacher who can guide you, but the practice of puja gets both regime and devotion in one, in a way that's, I think, more aligned with tantric practice and the tantric deity which you're trying to relate to. So that, having said all of that, these three things are good preparations for tantra. First, living a routinized life, Vedic life. Second, developing bhakti, devotion, which means no love, no, I'm sorry, no desire, no fear, just love. And thirdly, having a guru, but also daily performance of the instructions of the guru, which usually takes the form of like puja and japa, like that. Okay, so having said all of this, just one second, I'm gonna grab my shifman, and I just want to close. I want to close, if you don't mind, with just a little reading from this book. It's very beautiful. It's Sri Ramakrishna, A Prophet for the New Age. And I'm going to pick up the reading just from like, shortly after he arrives at Dakshineshwar. And he doesn't want to be the temple priest. He's very uncomfortable. His Brahminical standards are, of course, at odds with a lot of what's going on. So he doesn't want to be the temple priest. So this chapter is so beautiful. It's called Kali. It's just it's the name of the chapter. It's chapter 3. It's called Kali, and it's about arriving at devotion. So let's start. Gadadhar, Sri Ramakrishna's budding devotion had for the most part gone unnoticed. It was not yet unavoidable. It was not yet spectacular and flamboyant as it would soon become. For most men of the world, it would have been all but invisible. Perhaps only those who themselves wore the magic glasses of devotion could recognize in Gadadhar the Vesuvius glowing with an inner fire which was ready at any moment to erupt in spiritual splendor. Mathur Mohan, the son-in-law of Rani Rashmani, who owned the temple, was such a man. Mathur was hardly the sort one would have expected to show such remarkable spiritual sensitivity. A rich landowner and an associate in the affairs of the temple, he appeared every bit the swaggering dandy, bejeweled in costly silks, with a fine handlebar moustache waxed and glistening. But beneath the facade of the proud man of the world, the heart of a sincere and childlike devotee of the Divine Mother lay concealed. A devotee as capable as Gadadhar himself of weeping plaintively before Kali. The eyes of that hidden devotee had been strangely drawn to Gadadhar from the very beginning, and what Mathur saw was at once awe-inspiring, unsettling, and immensely attractive. He had observed the boy's spiritual moods. Moreover, he had the intuitive gifts to realize their import. Mathur found himself irresistibly attracted by the natural grace and the unstudied, kingly aloofness that set Gadadhar so clearly apart. He felt a subtle power emanating from the youth, a power which he could no more understand than ignore. Gradually, Mathur became possessed with the idea of involving Gadadhar fully in the life of the temple. Sri Ramakrishna did not want to do this. At first, sensing the elders' friendly interest, oh, here it is, Gadadhar reacted with a winged creature's instinctive mistrust of the snares of earthbound responsibility. That the responsibilities in this case would involve a temple and worship rendered them hardly less onerous in his eyes. In a sense, it made them even more so. For the principled Gadadhar, devotion was exclusively an affair of the heart between himself and his maker, not a service for hire or something to be performed mechanically according to a rigid liturgical schedule. You see, when devotion arises, this tension comes. I love this line. Furthermore, he shrank from taking responsibility for the worldly goods of the temple, but the wealthy and powerful Mathur was not accustomed to being refused, and the son of a peasant from Kamarpukur, for his part, was respectfully uncomfortable about refusing him directly. So rather than confront Mathur, Gadadhar decided to avoid him. Even his casual strolls around the temple grounds were planned accordingly. Mathur, however, could not be evaded indefinitely, and when their paths inevitably crossed, the elder was ready with his offer. Gadadhar, perhaps out of boyish good manners, felt reluctantly compelled to give in. Gadadhar agreed to perform a certain portion of the worship of Kali on the condition that his nephew, Hridoy, be given responsibility for the valuable ornaments of the deity. That is where things stood when Ram Kumar died. Ram Kumar is the elder brother. At that time, with one foot already caught in the door, as it were, Gadadhar did not resist stepping in completely. When Mathur offered him the position of head priest with full ritual duties, Gadadhar accepted. In making the appointment, Mathur predicted with uncanny foresight that the new priest would awaken the dormant image of Kali to spiritual life by the sheer vitality of his devotion. He might have added, with equal truth, that Kali would awaken the sleeping divinity in her young devotee. For the eternally childlike and trusting Gadadhar, the conception of God as a loving mother of the universe had a galvanizing effect, as we shall soon see. It should be mentioned here that aside from being an enthusiastic sponsor for his young priest and the first to gauge some of his inward potential, Mathur, as legend has it, is the one who gave him the name by which he would be known henceforth. It is by that name of his mature years, Ramakrishna, that we will refer to him from this point on. Okay, so check this out. In every possible sense, Ramakrishna's assumption of the priesthood of Kali was the watershed event in his life. The resolve to dedicate himself to God had remained until then essentially formless and unfocused. Now, virtually overnight, that devotion had coalesced. The figure of Kali around which his priestly days revolved acted as a powerful lens, concentrating the scattered rays of yearning to a point of flame. And burn Ramakrishna did with a ferocious intensity of devotion that has hardly been equaled in the history of religion. In retrospect, we can see that the tinder of ego had been well dried out in advance by an extraordinary purity of character and spirit of renunciation. I think that's an important point. The Vedic life, a life of rules, is a life of renunciation that snuffs out the ego, which then prepares us for the full plunge into devotion. So this yearning, which is unformed and unfocused, gets concretized when we choose an Ishta, like Rudra or like Kali. But it does presuppose that we have gone through some kind of purification and some ego effacement to some respect. Continuing, is it any wonder then that the mild and unassuming young man sprouted wings of fire? But to Ramakrishna's contemporary, the metamorphosis of caterpillar into fiery butterfly was pure, incomprehensible sorcery. His soaring, erratic flights of the spirits seemed to many the deranged dance of a madman, to others the symptoms of possession. A sympathetic few, like Mathur and Rani Rashmani, reserved judgment and watched in hypnotic fascination. But before plunging ahead with our young hero into that firestorm of devotion in which he was to be consumed for the better part of a decade, we would do well to take a brief detour, lest the reader be even more puzzled than were Ramakrishna's contemporaries by the startling events which are to be about to follow. We will find it useful to pause for a moment and ask two fundamental questions. Who exactly is this Kali? And what tremendous impulse drove Ramakrishna headlong toward her? Up until this point, our young priest's passions have been recognizable on a human scale. We can empathize with Gadadhar, the poet, sympathize with Gadadhar, the truant, dream with Gadadhar, the dreamer. We have no difficulty following him thus far. But Ramakrishna's road was about to turn precipitously, to incline steeply upward, and out of the gentle forested realm of our experience. What inspires a boy to reject hypocrisy and to forge his own way in the world is clear enough and requires no explanation. What causes him to emulate the mythic heroes of his land and romantically identify with them should also be familiar to anyone who has been a child. On the other hand, what drives a mature young man to conduct a frenzied pursuit of a stone goddess for years at a time is not so clear. Not, at any rate, in this day and age, when only sex, money, and worldly status are deemed worthy of our adult frenzy, and the gods and goddesses and God himself receive at best only our collective lip service and the occasional patronizing nod of Sunday sentiment while we busy ourselves with more practical matters. Schiffman has a really nice tone, like an editorial kind of writer's vibe. I like it. So we would do well to pause and remind ourselves that Ramakrishna's devotion also sprang from a universal fount of human experience. And however foreign, however intense, and however bizarre its expression, the basic impulse remains familiar. Kali, we just might discover, is but another name for our deepest yearnings. It is curious that we need even to ask who is Kali and what caused Sri Ramakrishna to pursue her so recklessly. For most of human history, the answer to these questions would have been self evident. Traditional cultures have called her by many different names and have worshipped her in countless different ways, but it never would have occurred to them to doubt her existence. Neither would it have occurred to our ancestors to question the wisdom of dedicating the best energy of a lifetime to her pursuit. Man is the child of the universe, an infant tied by the umbilical cord of space and time to that great nurturing mystery out of which he has, from no impulse of his own, been born, and into which he will, without his volition, inevitably return. Our dependency on that mystery is absolute. Our intimacy with it is also absolute. No human relationship can compare with it. Is it any wonder that we humans have propitiated and worshipped this maternal mystery at the very heart of our lives? Is it any wonder that we have personified her, prayed to her, whispered our deepest secrets to her, cried out to her in our pain and our joy, danced before her and wept before her? The real puzzle is why we have all but ceased to do these things. Why in our day and age Sri Ramakrishna's burning love for Kali needs to be justified or explained. That's a profound passage. Anyway, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. He goes into a really beautiful analysis of like science and religion and Sri Ramakrishna's very scientific approach. So here it is. The last of these three paths, he described the yogas, and the one that Sri Ramakrishna himself followed is Bhakti Yoga, the way of devoted surrender. The Bhakta is a person of the heart who feels towards the universe what a lover feels towards the beloved. Everything that the Bhakta perceives brings to the mind the divine beloved. Unlike the Jnani, he does not reject the world as illusory. On the contrary, he rejoices in creation and makes good use of its wonders as potent reminders of the bewitching attractiveness of his God. Nevertheless, he doesn't allow himself to forget that the world is just the outward costume that the Supreme has put on, precious to be sure, but only insomuch as it adorns the person of the beloved. Since he has surrendered himself, body, mind, and soul to God, the Bhakta does not think to scale the peak of vision on his own 2 feet. Instead, to use one of Ramakrishna's favorite analogies, he allows himself to be carried up by the divine beloved as a kitten allows its mother to carry it about without the least worry or personal effort. In Ramakrishna's view, bhakti is by far the easiest, the most direct, and the most practical spiritual path for people in our age. Pure knowledge and pure love are essentially one and the same thing, he claimed. Both lead the aspirant to the same goal, but the path of love is much easier. In the expansive capacity to love that we all share in common, Sri Ramakrishna recognized an unequaled power to rise above human limitations and to know God, the illimitable source of love and the lover for all his creation. Love, directed towards an infinite goal, becomes itself infinite, bursting the ephemeral bubble of personality, merging lover and beloved in an indissoluble divine union. And so he goes on to describe bhakti a little bit more. So, who is Mother Kali? We might say that she is a catalyst, a way station between us and the inconceivable Godhead, between the limited and the illimitable. However, if we were to stop there, Kali would remain an abstraction at best. And Kali is not an abstraction. Least of all was she an abstraction to Ramakrishna. On the other hand, there is the opposite danger that we will take her too literally and look only at the external form that she displays to the world. So, and then there's this explanation of the dark side of Kali and how those who are afraid of spirituality are afraid of her, but those who really love spirituality, who love her, will not be afraid, etc. He goes into the description of Kali as universal energy. And then finally, we'll say this. And now we'll watch Sri Ramakrishna in his puja. So remember, he has had a Vedic lifestyle up till this point, and now he's starting to feel bhakti. But he has an outlet for that bhakti, which is puja. So because he's the head priest, and because he already feels this like absolutely indescribable attraction for Kali, puja is the perfect outlet for him to express that. And yet, when Ramakrishna took over as temple priest at Dakshineshwar, this final realization was still many years in the future. From the start, he approached Kali not as a symbol of the omnipresent divine, still less as being identical with his own inner self. That's really beautiful. He didn't see Kali as his self, but with the simple faith that she was mother. So this is dualism, you see. So he goes from a Vedic lifestyle and he enters into religion, but as a devotee of Kali, so he has an Ishta, he has devotion, but he doesn't think that Kali is my very own essence nature. He doesn't even use Kali as a symbol for the abstract, omnipresent Brahman or anything. He just feels about Kali what one would feel about a mother, except this is the mother of the universe, the source and the final resting place. So he comes to this whole thing dualistically. And so did Vivekananda. And that's an interesting point. This great master of Advaita started his journey as a dualist. And so that's an important point. So anyway, Sri Ramakrishna comes to Kali as mother. Why does the God lover find such ecstatic delight in addressing the deity as mother? Ramakrishna once asked rhetorically. Because, and this is for you, Yami, this is a good line. Because the child is more free with the mother than with anybody else. And for that reason, she is the dearest of all. So to Yami's question earlier, like Ma Kali awakes this sense of shame in myself. Like I become so much aware of my wrongdoings. I feel not afraid, but being reprimanded. You can't. She's your mother. Her job is to clean you up when you get dirty. If you really felt about her that she is your mother, no problem. There's no shame. She's an indulgent and loving mother. So that's the whole thing. You have to feel about her how you would feel about the mother of the universe. And a mother's love, I mean, of course, this is the ideal mother's love, is unconditional. So this striking intimacy and playfulness characterized Sri Ramakrishna's relationship to the divine throughout his life. Intimacy and playfulness. This attitude might appear to us charmingly naive, but is it really so? Or is it the naivety of our own thinking that the Creator is immeasurably distant, off in some high heaven, or existing only as a kind of metaphysical abstraction, eternal, infinite, forever aloof, and unreachable by the products of his own creation? What has always set the great mystics apart from the merely religious is not the belief in God, or even the emotional intensity of that belief, but the belief in God as a personal fact. Christ and Saint Francis, Chaitanya and Ramakrishna were alike in treating the divine as the nearest and dearest of the soul. They walked with God and talked with him/her. They pleaded, argued, wept, and cajoled. To others, the intimacy often seemed blasphemous. The respectable and religious men of the world were greatly scandalized by it. Possibly, it struck them as a dangerously democratic idea that any man off the streets might go above their heads and converse directly with the King of Kings. Out of fear, they beheaded, they threw to the lions, they crucified, and when they didn't crucify, they suppressed. And when they felt secure enough in their ignorance not to suppress, they laughed derisively. I like that. Crucify, suppress, or laugh. But it made no difference to our heroes. Only one thing mattered to them, to remain in the good graces of their friend. All else was vanity. Here we must note that the situation has been somewhat different in India. As a rule, mystics have been suffered tolerantly there, even while they were doing and saying all the inconvenient things to which mystics are prone. Anyway, but Ramakrishna, never one for moderation where devotion to God was involved, stepped over the invisible boundaries of propriety time and again. More than a few eyebrows arched at his unconventional worship of Kali. Those who came to the temple to take part in the daily service would watch incredulously as the young priest, having completed the formalities of worship, staggered over to the idol like a drunkard. This one line is so beautiful. Having completed the formalities of worship, he then staggers towards the goddess like a drunkard. Right? That's really interesting. Anyway, having completed the formalities of worship, he staggered over to the idol like a drunkard, his chest and eyes flushed crimson from emotion, and caressed Kali endearingly on the chin, sang to her, held a morsel of food up to the cold stone lips, and pleaded with her to eat, and then caught hold of her stiff black arms to dance in ecstasy. There seemed to be no end to the eccentricities of this mad devotee. His worship became progressively less predictable, more bizarre. At times, Ramakrishna would sit like a catatonic, insensible, lost in tears or plaintive moans. Again, he would drift off into reverie in the midst of some ritual act and remain for hours on end, mechanically waving a camphor lamp before the idol, or going through the motions of an offering long after the flame had gone cold and the pile of flowers and leaves to be offered had dwindled to nothing. Gradually, Ramakrishna's obsession became so intense that every last vestige of normal routine in sleep, food, and personal hygiene was torn from its moorings and carried away in the frenzied whirlwind of devotion. He's gone from Gauni Bhakti, bhakti with rules and formalities, to prema, where all food rules, all sleep rules, all personal hygiene rules are just all gone. The problem is, people want this, but they never had any food rules or personal hygiene rules or like any rules to begin with. And then they want this ecstasy that sweeps all rules aside. Have the rules first. And then after Gauni Bhakti comes this prema, and through this prema, look what can happen. Right? All the rules get tossed out. So Sri Ramakrishna himself described the extraordinary state at this time as follows. And I think I'll just close with this. And this is, I think, a very important idea. See that? There's a nice fire going. Jaima. As I was perfectly unmindful of the cleaning of the body at the time, the hairs grew long and got matted of themselves, being smeared with dirt and dust. When I would sit in meditation, the body would become stiff and motionless like a stork through intense concentration of mind. And birds, taking it to be an inert substance, came and freely perched on the head and pecked into the matted hair in search of food. Sometimes I used to weep so intensely, the pangs of separation from God, that in great bitterness I rubbed my face in the earth. Often I used to get cut and bleed. In meditation, prayer, and other devotional practices, the day used to fly by so quickly that I was not conscious of it. And that's a nice idea, that in meditation and other devotional practices, the day would just fly by. He wasn't even conscious of it. Woo! At that time, hold on, let me turn this off. Mom, what you are doing? No, this lamp is an old ghee lamp, you see. Yeah. Yeah. It did exactly that. Anyway, at dusk, when the approach of night was announced by the ringing of bells and the blowing of the conch from the temple, I used to be reminded that the day had passed and the evening had set in. With this consciousness, a frenzy of despair would seize my soul, and I would throw myself on the ground and rub my face on it, crying out loudly, "Mother, another day has passed, and still you have not appeared before me." Wow. So the TLDR here is that through a Vedic lifestyle, through hygiene rules, food rules, through a regulated, formal approach to spiritual life, comes this madness, this ecstasy. And this ecstasy expresses itself firstly as this dualistic longing for a vision of Ma, for closeness to Ma, to feel her immediate tangible presence. So starting with dualism is very helpful in spiritual life actually. Relate to God as you would a child relating to its mother. And then through that, gradually we come to be closer and closer to God until the moth disappears into the flame. And then God alone is. So the problem with Advaita is sometimes we start with this idea of a very reified sense of who we think we are, and we want Ma to fit into that. So I am God, but in the sense that God must be me. Whereas what we're saying is the exact opposite. I am God in the sense that I am for God and I am in God and I am dissolved in God. God alone is. See, it's a very different statement, but it's very easy to make the sequencing error if we don't start with bhakti. So putting this all together, I think we start with first a Vedic lifestyle, then we move into a dualistic love for God, and then through puja, and this is the third thing we're going to add here, through puja, one can articulate both those goals in a way that's directly attributed to the deity. So I pray to Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the greatest lover of God next to Sri Ramakrishna. I pray to Ma Kali that we may have even one small fraction, one particle of this love that Ramakrishna and Chaitanya both felt for their ishtas. Like Ramakrishna and Chaitanya, may we be established in a sensible, balanced, and regulated life. Through that, may we attain sattva, and through sattva, may we attain bhakti, and through bhakti, may we attain true intoxication and true madness, which ultimately culminates in the oneness with God, who alone is, and to whom we offer all of these words. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanam Astu. Jai Shri Ramakrishna.